Hello everyone, I know you are going to use this video for falling asleep, so before that, like this video, subscribe to the channel and let me know where you are from, also what time is it. It started with a whisper. Not the kind that slips through conversations unnoticed, but a whisper that seemed to crawl straight into your spine, nestle into your bones, and wait there, patient, cold, hungry. No one believed Emily when she first said the house spoke to her. Her husband laughed it off. Her friends avoided the topic. But when she vanished without a trace, the town changed. They still talked about the house, but only in hushed voices, and never after dark. When James Ashford returned to his hometown of Whittershade after 20 years, he didn't come looking for answers. He came to bury his father, a man he hadn't spoken to in over a decade. The letter had come out of nowhere. No return address. Just 6 words, scribbled in his father's trembling hand. It's your turn now. Come home. Home was a word that never fit quite right in James' mouth. His childhood was a collection of closed doors, missing time, and half-remembered screams. His mother had disappeared when he was 10. They said she ran off, left a note. But James remembered the blood, just a small smear on the kitchen counter. Easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. No one ever talked about it again. As he drove the winding forest roads, the trees pressed in closer, as though the woods themselves were watching. The town's welcome sign appeared like a ghost through the mist. Whittershade, Est, 1834. The paint had peeled, the edges warped by time and rain. Below the name, someone had painted a crude message, "Don't stay past dusk." It had been half scrubbed away. Whittershade was smaller than he remembered. The gas station was gone. The school had collapsed in on itself, left to rot. People on the street watched him from behind cracked windows. None waved. He parked in front of his childhood home, 67 Ash Lane, and just stared. The house hadn't aged. That was the first thing he noticed. While everything around it had been gnawed by time, the Ashford house stood untouched, paint pristine, windows clean, roof tiles intact. It looked alive, like it had been waiting for him. James stepped out of the car, gravel crunching underfoot. The air was still. No birds, no wind. Just that whisper again. Soft, just under the edge of hearing. He couldn't make out the words. Not yet. The front door creaked open without touch. He stepped inside. The air smelled like pine and earth and something older. The furniture was still in place. His father's favorite chair. The grandfather clock that had never worked. The family portrait over the fireplace. But the eyes in the portrait, they didn't look painted anymore. They looked real. Watching. Remembering. James moved room to room, trying to ground himself. The living room was the same. So was the kitchen, except for the blood stain. It was still there. The same smear on the same counter, fresh despite 20 years. He reached out, touched it. It was warm. He stumbled back. His heart thudded in his chest. "This is insane," he muttered, rubbing his hand clean on his jeans. He tried to laugh, but the sound came out wrong. Nervous, tight. He made his way upstairs, passing by closed doors that seemed to hum as he walked by. Then he reached it. The attic door. It had been locked for as long as he could remember. No one ever went inside. His father said it was unsafe, that the floorboards were weak. But that door, it wasn't locked anymore. James stared at it, heartbeat ticking in his ears. The whispering was louder now, coming from behind the door. It wasn't just one voice. It was many, dozens, hundreds, overlapping, calling. He opened it. The attic was dark. He fumbled for the light switch and found none. Instead, a single bare bulb hung from the ceiling. Swaying gently despite the still air, he pulled the chain. The light snapped on. What he saw turned his stomach. The attic was full of mirrors, dozens of them, all shapes and sizes. Some cracked, others pristine. None of them reflected him. Instead, they showed other rooms, places he'd never seen before. A hospital hallway, a sunlit nursery, a basement with walls that bled, and then they changed. Each mirror began to show him, not the James that stood in the attic, but versions of himself, dying. In one, he hung from a tree. In another, he lay in a bathtub full of red water. In a third, he clawed at the attic door, begging to be let out, face pale, eyes wide with horror. James backed away, breath caught in his throat. The whispering rose to a scream. The bulb burst. Darkness swallowed the room. He slammed the attic door shut and stumbled back, nearly falling down the stairs. The house groaned around him, wood bending, walls creaking like bones settling. He fled the house. Outside, night had fallen, but his watch said it was only 2 p.m. The sun was gone. The streetlights flickered one by one. Shadows stretched longer than they should have. And the townspeople, those who had peered from windows, were now standing in the street, unmoving, eyes glowing faintly with a dull orange light. Watching, James jumped into his car, turned the key. Nothing. The engine was dead. The radio turned on by itself. White noise. Then a voice, crackling through the static. Familiar. His mother's voice. James, don't trust the mirrors. They lie. It's not real unless you believe it. He tore the radio from the dashboard, panting. This wasn't possible. This wasn't happening. But it was. The townspeople were getting closer. James left the car, running down the street. He didn't know where to go, just that he couldn't stay. He ducked into the old library, slamming the door shut behind him. Dust billowed. The scent of old paper filled his lungs. The library hadn't changed either. Rows of books stretched into darkness. The lights flickered overhead, and somewhere in the stacks, someone, or something, was moving. James crept forward, heart hammering. He reached the reference desk. Dust covered everything except one thing, a journal, open to a page dated October 31st, 1967. The house must feed. Every generation, one must return. The blood binds it. The blood remembers. The mirrors are doors. The attic is the mouth. Do not look too long. Do not listen too closely. It waits. The ink trailed off into a shaky line. Something creaked behind him. James turned. A woman stood there, pale skin, dark hair hanging wet around her face. Her eyes were hollow, sockets stretching too wide. She wore a faded nightgown stained with something dark. She raised a finger to her lips. "Shaha," she whispered. "They'll hear you." Then she was gone. James ran, journal in hand, out of the library, back into the unnatural dark. He had no plan, no weapon, just fear. But in that moment, it was enough. He made it to the church. The doors were open. Inside, candles lit themselves as he stepped in. The pews were empty. The altar dripped with black wax. A single figure knelt at the front, Father Marin, or what was left of him. James approached slowly. The priest's face was hollowed out, his eyes gouged. Yet he still spoke, voice a dry rasp. They watch through the mirrors. They feed on memory, on pain, on guilt. You brought them back. You opened the attic. Now it begins again. James knelt, voice shaking. What are they? The priest smiled with bloodied teeth. Your family, your past, your future. And then he burst into flames. The candles snuffed out. The doors slammed shut. The whispering returned, now inside the church. James clutched the journal. One phrase echoed in his mind, the attic is the mouth. Somehow, this all tied back to that room. That door, those mirrors. He had to go back. He had to know what the house wanted. Outside, the town was gone. Only the house remained, lit from within. Waiting. The whispers became words. Welcome home, James. And the door creaked open again. The door opened on its own again, as though the house had never truly shut it. James stood at the threshold, the weight of his breath thick in the still night air. The wind had died. The sky above seemed bruised, not quite night, not quite anything at all. Silence had settled over Widdershade like a blanket, smothering everything except for that insistent whisper, now a rasping murmur threading between his thoughts, beckoning him forward. He stepped inside. This time, the house felt warmer, no hotter. The air shimmered slightly, as if heat was rising from beneath the floorboards. Sweat beaded on his skin almost immediately, but he ignored it. The journal was clutched tight in his hand, its cover cracked and flaking. He wasn't sure why he hadn't let it go. Maybe because it was the only thing in this place that felt remotely solid, real. Or maybe because the words inside had started to shift when he wasn't looking. That's what had stopped him earlier, just before he re-entered the house. One line in the journal had changed. It was scrawled in the margins, written in a different hand, his own. Whatever you do, don't go into the basement. There was no basement. At least, he didn't remember there ever being one. But now that he was back inside, the house seemed different, subtly wrong in ways he couldn't name. The hallway was longer. The staircase tilted slightly to the left. The portrait above the fireplace had changed. His father's face was blurred now, smeared like someone had wiped it with an oily cloth. Only the eyes remained sharp, watching, judging. James walked past the kitchen, ignoring the blood smear on the counter that hadn't dried in 20 years. He didn't want to know if it was warm again. He took the stairs 2 at a time, fueled by a mix of dread and determination. The attic door loomed at the top, slightly ajar. But something made him stop. There was a new door. It hadn't been there before. Halfway down the upstairs hallway, between his old bedroom and the linen closet, a narrow wooden door stood flush with the wall, framed in dark iron. It was subtle, like it had always been there, but had simply waited for someone to see it. James stepped toward it, heart in his throat. The whispering stopped. Just like that, silence. It was worse than the sound. He reached for the handle. Cold. Not just chilly, but freezing. It burned his palm. He jerked away with a hiss, then looked down. No mark. No frost. But the door swung inward on its own, creaking slowly to reveal stairs descending into darkness. There was a basement. James didn't want to go down there, which, of course, meant he had to. He grabbed a flashlight from the hall drawer. Still there, just like he remembered, nestled beside yellowed batteries and broken rubber bands, and clicked it on. The beam wobbled. The batteries were weak. Shadows danced on the walls as he stepped down into the black. The air grew colder with each step, until it felt like ice was settling into his lungs. The stairs were wood, but they creaked wetly, like something inside them was alive. When he reached the bottom, he understood why the journal warned him. The basement wasn't just a room. It was a place. Endless. The beam of the flashlight couldn't find a back wall. The ground was dirt, soft and freshly turned. The ceiling disappeared into darkness. Shapes loomed just outside the light's reach. Furniture. Statues. He wasn't sure, but they didn't move. Yet, the walls were lined with shelves. On the shelves were jars, dozens of them, hundreds, each filled with murky liquid, and something else. James stepped closer, breath fogging. Eyes. Each jar contained a single human eye, and every single one turned to look at him. He staggered back, knocking into something solid. He spun, flashlight shaking. It was a mirror, one of the same ones from the attic. But this time, it showed something new. Not a twisted version of his death. Not a stranger's room. It showed the basement. Him standing exactly where he was. But in the reflection, something loomed behind him. Huge. Crawling. A mass of limbs and mouths. It was reaching. He turned. Nothing. But the floor moved. The dirt rippled. Then a hand broke through. It was small. Pale. A child's hand grasping upward, covered in soil. Another hand followed. Then a face. Eyes closed. Mouth agape. No breath. James couldn't move. The child dragged itself free from the earth, followed by another, and another, all children. All dead. Their skin pallid, lips blue. But none of them decayed. They looked fresh, as if they'd just been buried minutes ago. And they were all reaching for him. Jamie's. One of them whispered. He stumbled back. The jar shelf tipped. Glass shattered. The smell was unbearable, rotted flesh and old blood. The eyes on the floor blinked as they rolled. Then he heard it. Footsteps. Heavy. Deliberate. Coming down the stairs. He turned his flashlight toward the steps. It was his father. Or what used to be his father. The man's body was bloated, skin stretched tight over bone, and his face, James couldn't see his face. It was covered in what looked like mirror shards, embedded into his flesh like a mask. Light from the flashlight bounced across each jagged piece, reflecting 1,000 distorted versions of his own terror. James. The thing rasped, voice wet and wrong. "It's your turn." James ran. He didn't think. He just ran. Up the stairs, through the hall, past the kitchen. The house twisted around him, rooms changing places, doors closing just before he reached them. He slammed his shoulder into the front door, but it was gone. Only a wall. A mirror now stood in its place, and it showed him. Older, empty-eyed, standing beside his father, mirror-faced and grinning. Behind them, the children reached. He screamed. Then the mirror cracked. Just a thin line at first. Then it shattered completely, falling inward like it had no backing, only a void behind it. Black, absolute nothing. And out of that void came a sound. Not a whisper this time. A laugh. Low, cruel, familiar. James didn't wait. He turned, and the attic door was there again. Open. Waiting. He ran up. The stairs bent under his weight, but didn't break. The attic light flickered on without touch. The mirrors were all gone, replaced by paintings. Each one showed someone he knew, people from the town. Friends long forgotten, even his mother. Each portrait moved slightly, like a frame caught mid-breath. One painting was still blank. Below it, a nameplate JASASHFORD. He heard the laughter again, but this time it came from his own mouth. The attic door slammed shut behind him, and the whispering returned in full force. But now it spoke his name. James didn't remember falling asleep. One moment he was standing in the attic, heart hammering, throat raw from screaming, and the next he was lying on the cold wooden floor, staring up at the rafters as soft light poured in through the cracks in the ceiling. The whispering was gone. The portraits hung motionless, just paintings again, normal, still, but that didn't settle him. It made it worse. The quiet felt forced, like a breath being held too long. He sat up slowly, every joint stiff. His name was still on the wall below the blank canvas. Jamis ACFORD, black letters carved into brass. It hadn't changed overnight. The painting above it remained unfinished. White canvas stretched and ready, as if waiting for the brush to move. He half expected it to shift in front of him, for his face to emerge in brushstrokes like smoke curling from a fire. James stood, the floor creaking underfoot. A brittle chill lingered in the air despite the sunlight. The other portraits were just as he remembered. His mother's face stared back at him from one frame, sad eyes, mouth slightly parted as if she were about to speak. Her eyes followed him, subtly, gently but unmistakably. The townspeople were there too, faces half familiar, features distorted just enough to make him question what he really remembered. He moved toward the attic stairs, hand brushing the edge of the doorframe, but paused when he heard it, a scratching sound, faint, from behind one of the walls. He tilted his head. There it was again, a gentle scrape, then a pause, then another. It was an animal. It was too slow, too purposeful, like fingers searching. James backed away, looking around for the source. Then he saw at a seam in the wall behind one of the larger portraits, a hidden door. It hadn't been there before, or maybe it had, and the painting had kept it secret. He reached out and pulled the portrait aside. The wall behind it was cracked open just slightly, like someone had started to enter and thought better of it. There was no handle, just darkness beyond the split. He hesitated, then pushed. The wall gave way with a groan, revealing a narrow corridor. No light, no breeze. The scratching sound stopped. Something about this passage was wrong. It smelled of dust and candle wax and something older, like forgotten places, sealed too long. He took a step inside. The air felt thicker here, dense with age. The walls were close, close enough that his shoulders brushed against the wood. Cobwebs clung to his arms. The space twisted slightly, curving downward without stairs. A gentle slope that should not have existed in a house this size. After a few minutes of walking, James realized he was descending. The house was folding into itself, drawing him somewhere deeper than the basement. Somewhere it had hidden even from itself. Then he reached the end. A heavy door stood before him, black wood carved with symbols he didn't recognize. Circles within circles, jagged lines intersecting. It looked ancient, not painted or etched, but grown into the wood, like veins under skin. James didn't want to open it, but he did. Inside was a room far too large to exist under a house. A single chandelier hung from the center, casting weak yellow light. The walls were lined with more paintings, but these weren't portraits, they were scenes. Horrors. Families around dinner tables where something watched from the corner. Children playing in hallways too long, their shadows moving the wrong way. Doors that opened into mouths. And in each painting, a single figure appeared again and again. Sometimes a man, sometimes a boy, sometimes something in between, but always with James' face. He backed away, stomach turning. This was beyond memory, beyond nightmare. These weren't just hallucinations, they were records. Something had painted these. Something had been watching him his whole life. At the center of the room was a pedestal. On it sat a book, not the journal he carried, but older, bound in skin. Breathing, it pulsed faintly, like a heart left beating after its owner had died. He didn't want to touch it, he had to. The moment his fingers brushed the cover, the air in the room changed. The walls trembled, paintings rattled on their hooks, and the chandelier flickered out. Darkness swallowed everything. He opened the book by instinct, pages fluttering until they stopped on one image. It was a sketch of his house. Every floor, every hidden stair, rooms he didn't know existed. But one thing stood out. At the center of the drawing, beneath the very foundations, was a shape, a figure, sleeping, trapped in a pit shaped like a mouth. He blinked, and suddenly the floor wasn't beneath him anymore. He was falling. The air screamed past his ears. Cold, sharp air that burned. He landed hard, not on dirt, but on tile. Smooth, cold, wet. When he looked up, he was in a new place. A room tiled like an old hospital. White walls stained with brown streaks. Flickering lights overhead. A gurney stood in the center, leather straps hanging loosely off the sides. It looked used. The mirrors lined the walls again. But now they weren't showing him. They were showing others, dozens of people, all strapped down, all screaming, and behind each of them something loomed, a shape, long fingers, no face, only a mouth that whispered. James staggered forward. The gurney scraped slightly. He reached for one of the mirrors, hoping, praying, that touching it would break the illusion. But it wasn't an illusion. The mirror rippled. His hand passed through. He jerked back, but it was too late. The world twisted, and he was pulled inside. Now he was the one strapped down. The leather was tight around his wrists, chest, ankles. He struggled, but it held. Something dripped from the ceiling, onto his face. Warm, sticky. He looked up. Above him was another version of himself. Smiling, holding a scalpel. "Don't fight it," the reflection said, his voice calm. "This is where it always leads." James screamed. The world shattered. He woke on the attic floor again. But now there were no portraits, only mirrors, and every one of them was empty, except one. It showed the attic just as it was. But in the reflection, the door was open. Something stood just outside it, watching, waiting. The whispering returned. This time it was behind him. James didn't turn around. He wanted to. Every part of him screamed to spin and face the whisper, to prove it wrong, to confirm that nothing stood there. But fear anchored him. The kind of fear that isn't loud or chaotic, but sharp and surgical. It wrapped its fingers around his spine and held him in place. The whisper behind him wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It had a rhythm, a cadence, a familiarity that cut deeper than screaming ever could. It was humming, a lullaby. He knew it. His mother used to sing it. That was the final crack in his resolve. James turned, and nothing was there, just the attic, still. Dust floating lazily in the shafts of light, the mirrors lining the walls again, silent and bare. The white canvas above his name still waited, clean and untouched. But the air wasn't the same. It was thick now, as if something had just passed through, brushing against the room like a draft that left no trail, but carried weight all the same. He moved to the attic stairs again, hand trembling on the railing. Something had changed. The space felt looser somehow, like reality was stretching, like the house was struggling to hold itself together. Or worse, like it was growing. James descended the stairs, each creak a countdown he couldn't place. The hallway was longer again. By now he stopped being surprised. The house was shedding its disguise piece by piece, revealing not just hidden rooms, but its own anatomy. As if it was never a house to begin with, just the shell of something that wanted to be a house for him. He passed his old bedroom. The door was gone. Only a wall remained, warped and pulsing faintly under his fingertips. Not with heat, with breath. The house was breathing. He pulled his hand away. It left an imprint. Not just a handprint in the dust or a faint pressure mark. It sank, just for a second, as though the wall gave way under him, like skin. Soft and fleshy. James backed up, heart racing. That's when the door appeared. At the end of the hall. It hadn't been there before. It didn't look like the others. This door was made of bone, real bone. Thick, yellowing, fused together in knots of spine and rib, finger bones arching into a handle. And behind it, he could hear the breathing. Not the slow inhale, exhale of the house's subtle pulse. This was deeper, thicker, a breath that had weight. That changed the room each time it dragged through the air. He approached the door because he didn't have a choice. Not really. That was the thing about the house. It never forced him. It just made everything else impossible. And so he wrapped his fingers around the bone handle. It was warm. It pulsed under his grip. And when he turned it, it sighed. The door opened inward with a wet pop, and James stepped into a hallway that couldn't exist. It was long. Longer than the town of Wittershade. Longer than the woods. A corridor made of shifting flesh and flickering lights, lined on both sides with doors that looked almost, but not quite, normal. Wooden doors, brass knobs, but the wood bent at odd angles. The brass knobs had too many keyholes. Some doors whispered. Some thumped, as though something inside wanted out. James stepped forward. The door closed behind him without a sound. He walked. One door passed, then another, then a third. Each door bore a nameplate. Not just names, dates, birth dates, death dates. A few were blank. One door read Eliza B.H. Ashford, born 1962, died unknown. His mother. He stopped, hand trembling as he reached for the knob. He didn't want to know what was behind it, but he had to know. He owed it to her. To himself. The door didn't open. It blinked. The wood shifted, reshaping like flesh, and an eye opened in its center. It was brown, his mother's eye. It looked at him, and it wept. A single tear of thick black liquid rolled down, vanishing into the cracks of the wood. James stumbled away. The door closed itself. Further down the hallway, something screamed. Not a person, not an animal, something else. It was inside the walls. James ran. He didn't know where he was going, only that he couldn't stop. The hallway blurred around him. The doors melted into shadows. He kept running until he tripped. Over a body. He hit the ground hard, scraping his palms. When he looked up, the corridor had changed again. Now it was a hospital hallway. Too clean, too white. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The floor smelled of disinfectant and metal. The body he had tripped over wore a patient's gown. It was him, or a version of him. Eyes open, mouth agape, throat slit. James scrambled back, heart hammering. The body twitched. Then it sat up. Blood poured from its mouth. "You're getting close," it gurgled. But you won't like what's waiting. It collapsed again, twitching once more before falling still. James got to his feet, backing away. The hallway behind him was gone. Only one door remained. No nameplate, no handle, just a slit down the center. Slowly pulling apart like lips opening for breath, he had no choice. James stepped through. Darkness, then a voice. His mother's again. Closer this time. Sharper. You shouldn't have come back, Jamie. He turned. She was there. Standing in the dark, her face pale, eyes sunken, lips cracked and trembling. She wore the same nightgown she'd vanished in all those years ago. He whispered, "Where did you go?" She didn't answer. Instead, she pointed behind him. James turned. A mirror stood there, tall, framed in bone. And in the reflection, he wasn't alone. Behind him stood himself, but not quite. This James was smiling, and in his hand was a knife. James turned again, fast, but the room was empty. When he looked back at the mirror, it was cracked down the middle. The reflection whispered, "You've been here before." The room exploded into screaming, not his voice, not hers. Everyone, all at once, the town, the attic, the basement, the mirrors. All the voices James had heard, all the faces, all the deaths. A cacophony of pain and rage and grief. He dropped to his knees, covered his ears, but the mirror still spoke. "You're the last piece." A light flicked on, a single bulb overhead, and he realized where he was, back in the attic. Again, the mirrors were gone. Only one thing remained. The blank canvas above the brass nameplate. And now it wasn't blank. It showed him, not as he was, but as he would be, standing in the doorway, smiling, knife in hand, and behind him the house, mouth open, waiting. James couldn't breathe. The painting was perfect, every detail sharp and vivid, as if the canvas had been painted not with brushes, but with memory. It showed the exact contours of his face, the slight scar on his chin from a fall as a child, the fray in his shirt sleeve he hadn't noticed until now. But what made it unbearable was the expression. The man in the painting was smiling. Not a smile of joy or comfort or relief, but a grin stretched too far, too confident. It knew something James didn't. And in the painting's background, the house was different. Alive, pulsing with color and shadow, windows glowing like eyes, shingles breathing in and out, the whole structure bending in a slow rhythm like lungs hidden under floorboards. He backed away, eyes still fixed on the canvas. The attic creaked softly behind him, the house settling once again, but now every groan sounded like a voice just below language. The silence stretched, threatening to snap. Then something moved, just barely. He saw it out of the corner of his eye. One of the other portraits. A shift in the eyes. He turned to look. Nothing. Still, painted. But his gut clenched. The movement hadn't been imagined. He scanned the wall again. There were fewer paintings now. 5 or 6 were missing. Frames empty. Canvases torn free. Brass nameplates left hanging crooked and abandoned. Only faint outlines in the dust remained where the pictures had been. They had walked away. He didn't understand it, didn't want to understand it, but the truth pressed at the edges of his mind like heat behind the eyes. The house wasn't haunted. That word was too small, too human. It was possessed, but not by spirits, by something deeper, older. It didn't just feed on fear, it preserved it, archived it, filed it away like memories in a dream that never ended. And James was next. The painting told him that. A shiver worked down his spine, and he turned on instinct. The attic door was open again, and someone stood in it. A man, about his height, broad shoulders, tired eyes. He looked like James, 10 years from now. Older, rougher, and as he stepped forward, the flickering light caught the edge of something in his hand, a mirror shard, long, sharp. The older James didn't speak. He simply stared, eyes hollow, mouth moving silently. Then, he pointed to the painting above the brass plate and gave a slow nod, like a parent teaching a child to accept a truth he's not ready for. James ran. He didn't look back, didn't listen for footsteps. He tore down the stairs, barely noticing that the walls were bleeding now. Thick black liquid oozed from the seams in the wallpaper, dripping in slow rivulets across old family photos. His feet slipped on the floorboards, and he crashed into the living room. It was no longer the living room. The furniture was gone. The walls had receded. In their place were shelves, rows upon rows of dusty books and locked boxes, each labeled with a name. He recognized some of them, people he'd known. Others he didn't. Each box seemed to hum slightly, vibrating with quiet memory. He reached for one. Georgwh Farad 1903-1946. He opened it. Inside was a locket, a small one, gold, with a tiny dent in the corner. When he touched it, he remembered, but not his own memories. A war, a letter, a betrayal. He gasped and dropped the box. The memory lingered, sticky and clinging. The house didn't just preserve fear. It absorbed it, held it in trust like an archive of pain, and it wanted him to become part of that archive. He kept moving. The hallways changed as he walked. Sometimes they shrank to narrow slits he had to squeeze through. Other times they opened into vast, dark chambers with no ceiling, the walls pulsing faintly with breath and sound and things he could almost, but not quite, understand. He found the kitchen again. It hadn't changed. The bloodstain was still there, but now it formed words: sty, remember. He turned to leave and saw his mother again. This time, she wasn't a vision. She was there, in the flesh, standing barefoot on the tiles, her hair limp with sweat, her skin translucent with the weight of years spent beneath. Her eyes were hollow and full. "James," she said, voice cracking. He shook his head. "You're dead." "No," she whispered. "I'm remembered." He didn't understand. She stepped forward, her body moving like it hurt to exist. "The house keeps what it loves, holds us in pieces. Some of me is still in the attic, some in the basement, some in the walls. But my memory, my shape, is here." You brought it closer. James took a step back, heart racing. She reached for him, pleading. "Don't go to the basement again. There's something down there," he said. "Something that knows me." She shook her head slowly. "It doesn't know you. It made you." "What are you talking about?" he asked, voice rising. "What does that mean?" But she was already fading, peeling away like smoke, her body breaking into strands of dust that curled into the walls. As she vanished, she left behind only one word breathed on the edge of silence. Door. James turned again. The hallway behind him had changed, stretched. At the end of it now was a new door. Not made of bone this time. This one was wood, plain, ordinary. But something about it felt wrong. Deeply, horribly wrong. As if something behind it didn't belong in the world, but had been pushed into it. And this door was the only thing holding it back. He walked toward it slowly. Each step felt like it took hours. When he reached the door, he found no handle, no hinges, just wood and breath. And then a heartbeat, faint, not his own. He pressed his palm against the surface, and the door breathed in. The wood shifted under his touch. Warmth flowed through it, wet and living. The door exhaled slowly, and with that breath came words, not spoken aloud but pressed directly into his mind. "You were born to remember." James reeled back. His head buzzed, like something massive was waking up inside his skull. He staggered into the wall, and it rippled. A mouth opened in the plaster, not metaphorically, a mouth, full of teeth. It smiled, and whispered, "Open the door, James. Let us in." James turned and ran, back through the hall, through the melting rooms, past the empty portraits. He didn't stop until he was outside the house again, panting, soaked in sweat. The sky overhead bruised with a sick red glow. Night hadn't come, but the sun was dying just the same. He didn't remember opening the door. He didn't remember how he got outside. But he knew one thing with a terrible certainty. The house had let him go. Not because he'd escaped, but because it wasn't finished yet. It was remembering him. And once it had every piece, once it knew every memory, every fear, every sin, then it would take him. Not before. And the worst part, a part of him wanted to go back, because now he needed to know what waited behind the door that breathed. James didn't sleep. He sat in his car, staring at the house, knuckles white around the steering wheel. The engine still wouldn't start. The keys clicked uselessly. No spark. No rumble. Just silence, broken only by the wind rattling through the trees like bones in a tin can. Outside, the town of Wittershade was still empty, as if it had been scrubbed clean of life. No cars passed. No voices drifted from porches. No lights blinked in windows. The whole town felt like a photograph left out in the rain, faded and warped, yet stubbornly there. He should have left, walked, run if he had to. But the house had sunk its hooks into him. That quiet pull beneath the skin was still there, whispering just below conscious thought. He could almost feel it in his teeth. The same word over and over. Remember. But it wasn't just the memories that haunted him now. It was the sensation that they weren't his. Or, more disturbingly, that they were, but someone, or something, had been watching them as they formed. Each flicker of childhood, each nightmare he had as a boy, each secret he thought he'd buried. They weren't safe. The house had them now, and it had begun to paint with them. At some point, as the sky began to lighten, James got out and walked back toward the front door. It was open. He hadn't left it that way. He stepped inside. The smell hit him first. Burned wood, ash, and something thicker beneath it, like scorched meat. The house was darker, even with morning bleeding into the windows. The light didn't reach far. It recoiled at the threshold, like it wanted nothing to do with what lived inside. The hallway was different again. Shorter, one door at the end. He didn't remember this part of the house. Didn't want to. But the air was thick with heat, rising in waves from under the door like the breath of some great animal waiting just behind it. As he stepped forward, the wallpaper peeled off the walls beside him in long strips, revealing what looked like skin stretched tight over wood. The house wasn't hiding anymore. It didn't need to. The door at the end was metal, blackened, stained with rust and soot. A thick, iron wheel sat in its center like a vault. He placed his hand on it. It was hot, but not burning. It felt inviting. He turned it. The door groaned open on massive hinges, and the heat hit him full force, dry and choking. Inside was a furnace room, but not like anything you'd find in a normal house. This one was cavernous. Red light poured from the center, where a massive furnace pulsed like a heart. Pipes snaked across the ceiling and down the walls, some of them shifting slightly, twitching, as if drawing breath, and in front of the furnace were the portraits. Hundreds, stacked, leaning, melting. They slid off their frames, paint bubbling, features warping into something unrecognizable. The brass nameplates hissed in the heat. Some burst into flame. But even as they burned, James could hear the voices behind the canvas, soft, pleading, whispering. "Don't forget me. Let me go." We were here. He walked forward, mesmerized. The furnace door creaked open just slightly, and from within he saw something flicker. An image caught in flame like a reflection in water. His mother in the kitchen, smiling, cooking something. But there was no sound. Her mouth moved, but it was wrong. Like the image had been recorded by something that didn't understand language, only the shape of it. Then the image shifted. The same room, now empty. Blood smeared across the floor in a spiral, and in the center of the spiral a child. Him, crouched, rocking, whispering. James stumbled back. A pipe overhead snapped, spewing steam into the air. The walls shrieked as if in pain. From behind the furnace, something began to move. Heavy, deliberate, slow. He hid behind a stack of fallen portraits. Whatever it was, it dragged its limbs. Nails or claws scraped against the floor with a dull screech. The heat grew more intense, but it wasn't just the furnace now. It was the thing behind it. It pulsed with warmth that wasn't physical. An emotional heat. Memory made manifest. Raw guilt, shame, regret. James peeked and saw it, a creature stitched from ash and faces, literally. Its body was a patchwork of melting portraits. Mouths stretched open across its limbs, eyes blinking in places eyes should never be. It had no head, only a smear of darkness where its face should be. But it saw him, somehow, and it spoke, not aloud, but through the portraits. Every voice he'd ever known, every person he'd ever forgotten. "You let us burn." James bolted. The stack toppled behind him, portraits shattering on the ground, screaming as they cracked. He ran toward the metal door, but it had closed. Sealed. The iron wheel spun uselessly when he tried it. Behind him, the creature dragged closer, its breath like hot wind pushing against his back. There was only one other way out, through the furnace. It sounded insane, but as he looked at it, the door stood open wider now, flames swirling with unnatural grace, and within the fire he saw something else, a room, wooden, small, a nursery. He recognized it, his nursery. Somehow, the furnace was a doorway, or maybe a memory. Either way, it was his only chance. James took a breath and jumped. The heat didn't burn, it welcomed. He passed through flame like water and fell forward, collapsing onto a wooden floor. Cool now. Clean, quiet. He looked up. He was in the nursery. Not a memory of it. The nursery. The wallpaper he remembered. The rocking chair. The cracked mobile above the crib. Everything exactly as it had been. Even the smell, baby powder and old dust. The house had taken him backward. He stood slowly. Something rustled behind the crib. He crept forward, expecting, he didn't know what. Another version of himself. A ghost. Something worse. But it was a child. A girl, no more than 6, pale, dark eyes. She looked up at him, no fear in her face. "You're not supposed to be here yet," she said. His throat tightened. "Who are you?" She smiled faintly. "I'm the first. The very first memory. I live here." James knelt, his voice barely a whisper. "What is this house?" She shrugged. "It remembers everything. That's what it's for. It holds us so the world doesn't forget." "Who built it?" She tilted her head. "No one builds a mouth, James. It just opens." The door behind her creaked. He looked, and there it was again. The door that breathed. Still closed. Still pulsing, but closer now. Closer than ever. The little girl stood. "You'll have to open it eventually. That's where it all ends." James shook his head. "What's behind it?" Her smile faded. "All the things we shouldn't remember." Then she vanished, and the floor opened beneath him. He fell again, into the dark, and this time the house whispered not with voices, but with names. His name, over and over, as if it was writing him into its walls, forever. When James woke, he was lying on something soft and yielding. Not fabric, not dirt, something in between. Like flesh left too long under pressure. He didn't move at first. The air was thick and damp, muffling every sound, turning each breath into a slow drag through invisible syrup. It took him a moment to realize he wasn't alone. The silence was crowded, full of breath not his own, full of presence. He sat up. He was in a tall, circular chamber. The walls curved upward, narrowing to a dark throat high above, like a silo that stretched far beyond sight. But this place wasn't built of stone or brick. The walls were etched, no, covered with names. Thousands, tens of thousands, each carved into the surface with a thin, almost delicate hand, as though whoever wrote them had done so with care. The names layered over one another, some crossed out, others glowing faintly, like dying embers, but all still visible. All still here. The ceiling was too far away to see. There was no door. James stood, knees weak, spine sore from the fall. As he moved, something crunched beneath his foot. He looked down and saw a nameplate, shattered in two. Brass, clean lettering. His breath caught. Susan R. Hello Wawai, 1970-1996. He didn't know the name, but he knew the feeling. Whoever she had been, whatever life she'd lived, it was here now. Trapped, preserved, remembered without warmth. This silo was not a monument. It was a tomb of memory, a graveyard of identity. He walked the circle once, then again, The names began to blur. Faces flickered in the edge of his vision. Men, women, children, all watching, never speaking. The silence held them, caged them. Each name was an anchor, a chain, and somewhere along the curve of that monstrous wall, he saw his own name. Stopped him cold. Jamsam Asafar. No dates, not yet. But it was fresh, no dust, no scratches, just a name newly carved into the wall, waiting to be finished. A placeholder. As if the house was still deciding how it would end him. He touched the letters, and the wall exhaled. Behind him, something stirred, not footsteps, not breathing, but a sensation, like thought turned physical, like memory waking up. He spun around and saw the shapes, 3 of them, emerging from the curvature of the wall. Not people, not fully. They looked like silhouettes of faces pushed into thin plastic, straining against the surface, features distorted, mouths gaping. They drifted closer. Each of them had names scrawled across their faces. One whispered, "You forgot me." James stumbled backward. The whispers intensified, all around him now. Names sliding past his ears, sliding into his skull, carried on memory and blame. His knees buckled. "You forgot us all." The figures didn't touch him. They didn't need to. Their presence peeled back pieces of him. Moments. Fragments. The way his mother laughed when she danced in the kitchen. The smell of old pine in his father's coat. The first time he lied. The first time he wished someone dead. They came free of him, floating, absorbed by the walls. He was being remembered, not by choice, by force. His thoughts scattered, pulled in all directions. The silo pulsed with new breath. A voice rose from the walls, not the house this time, something older, something deeper, the voice of memory itself, cold and detached, timeless. "You are the archive, flesh shaped into pages. You walk only so others may read." He clutched his head, but the voice kept drilling inward. "To forget is to starve us. To remember is to feed." Then silence. The pressure stopped. He opened his eyes. The silo was gone. He was in a hallway again. This one narrow and crooked, like a spine bent with age. The walls leaned in. Water dripped somewhere in the dark. Every step he took echoed louder than it should have. He knew where he was going. Back to the door that breathed. It had to be. It was calling to him now, not with whispers, but with memories. But not his. They were jumbled, flashes of other people's lives. A woman cradling a stillborn child. A boy locking himself in a closet to escape the shouting. A man watching fire eat through his childhood home. The memories tore through him like wind through rotting curtains. He stumbled through the dark. The door appeared ahead. Wood. Old, still pulsing with breath. But now it had a crack in the center. Small, just wide enough to see through. He peered in and saw himself. Not in a mirror. Not a reflection. It was another James, kneeling in a white room, writing on the floor with something red and wet. Writing names. Over and over and over. And each time he finished one, it vanished into the floor, and he began again. Tirelessly, mindlessly. His eyes were empty. His lips moved in silence. James reached toward the crack, and the door inhaled sharply, yanking him forward, slamming him into its surface. He gasped. Pain spiked in his chest. He was no longer outside the door. He was inside the room. It was white, endless. The kind of white that hurt to look at. No shadows, no corners, just space and names, carved into everything. The floor, the walls, the air itself seemed to shimmer with lettering. The other James sat nearby, still writing. Unblinking, James took a step closer. The other him looked up and smiled. "You made it," he said, voice calm. "Now we can begin." "Begin what?" James asked. The second James offered him the tool, a piece of bone sharpened to a point. "You write? You remember? That's what you're for." James shook his head. "I'm not staying here." The smile widened. "You already have." And the walls began to pulse again. The room was alive. The house wasn't around them anymore. They were the house now. And the door that breathed. It no longer separated them from what was inside, because now they were what was inside. The writing began, and somewhere in the real world, the attic gained a new portrait, and a fresh nameplate beneath it. JMSM, A-RD 1976, waiting to be finished. James didn't know how long he'd been writing. Time had thinned out into a smear. One long, dripping moment stretched across an endless white canvas. The room never changed. No clocks, no day, no breath of breeze to carry the illusion of passing hours. Just names. More names than he thought the world could hold. Every name he carved into the floor disappeared seconds after, absorbed by whatever white force this place was made of. He tried to stop. Tried to drop the bone shard, to walk away, to scream. But each time he hesitated, the other James, the smiling one, was there again, just close enough to whisper. "You owe them this," he said once, crouching beside him. "You walked through their memories, took their fear. The least you can do is remember them right." James didn't remember agreeing. He only remembered the hunger that came when he didn't write. Not in his stomach, in his head. A gnawing, scraping itch behind his eyes, like tiny fingers trying to dig their way out. So he wrote, and wrote, until something new happened. The floor trembled. It wasn't a quake, not like the world was shifting beneath him, but a subtle shudder, like something massive had just turned over in its sleep. The other James froze mid-carve. For the first time since James had entered the white room, that perfect, placid smile cracked. "She's waking up," the other James said. James blinked. "Who?" The smile vanished entirely. The first one. The one who built this place with her screams. A fissure opened in the floor nearby, black and narrow. It pulsed once, breathing, of course, and then began to speak. Not with words, with faces. They rose from the fissure one by one, stretched and half-formed, as if molded from wax that had never cooled. Some were intact, others melted, twisted, eyeless. But they all looked at him, even the ones with no sockets to stare from. They hovered midair, mouths opening as if to speak. And then, in one unified chorus, they sang. Not music, not language. A vibration, a sound meant only for bone. James dropped the bone shard. His hands shook violently, fingers twitching as if memory itself was trying to leak out through his fingernails. The other James didn't move, didn't blink. He simply whispered, "You hear it now, don't you?" James swallowed. "What is that?" "The name of the house," he said. "Its true name." "I don't want to know it," James said. "You already do. That's why it brought you back, because you carried it with you your whole life." The fissure widened. A wind rose, dry and cold, and scented like a tomb cracked open too early. From the gap, more figures began to crawl. Not just faces now, bodies. Some twisted like vines, arms grown too long, torsos bent backward, jaws unhinged. Others looked freshly dead, still dressed, still bleeding. One of them was his father. James stepped back. No. The man's chest had a hollow in it, like something had been scooped out and never filled. His face was calm, but not peaceful, just empty. He opened his mouth, and ash spilled out, coating the white floor like snowfall. James heard the same thing from every mouth now, whispered in different voices, different tones, all forming the same words. "It's your turn to feed us." The air thickened. Behind the crawling bodies, something else emerged. A figure. She walked slowly, barefoot in a dress that dragged behind her like a wedding gown dipped in tar. Her face was obscured by a veil, thin and shifting like the air behind heat. But James knew her. Every part of his body recoiled in recognition before his brain could catch up. The first one. The builder of the house. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. With a flick of her hand, the other James collapsed, folded in on himself like cloth being drawn into a drain. No scream, just removal. He was gone. James stood paralyzed. The woman stopped in front of him. She raised her hand again. And suddenly James was in the fissure, surrounded by memories that weren't his, people who had never lived, names that never belonged to anything but shadows. He was drowning in invented fear, fabricated pain. Whole lives crafted from nothing but need. The house fed on memory, yes, but it preferred fiction. It craved fear that didn't belong, tragedy born from lies believed so deeply they became real. James screamed as the house poured stories into him. A boy buried in a coal bin. A girl who bled out in a silent choir room. A man who clawed his own eyes out after seeing too many faces behind mirrors. The house gave him these memories, and as he believed them, he wrote them into existence. That's what the writing was. Not remembering. Inventing. James had been forging pain for the house, feeding it, building its rooms with fiction so potent it turned real. Every ghost, every corridor, every breathing door, he had made it all. The woman reached up and removed her veil. It was his mother, but not her. Not really, just a mask, a shape the house wore to keep him compliant. As he stared, her face shimmered, shifted, became another woman. Then another, then a child, then something with no eyes at all. It was wearing all of them. Every person he'd ever imagined. Every fear he'd ever believed in. And in a voice that sounded like every voice he'd ever known, the house spoke through her. Write one more name, James. Just one, and you can leave. His fingers burned. The bone shard lay at his feet, slick with something dark. He crouched, picked it up, held it to the floor. One last name. He knew whose it would be. The only name that would finish the story. His. He wrote slowly. AJMES1ATCHEVDDIBU-ASFORD. The moment the last letter sank into the floor, the white room shuddered. The faces screamed. The woman began to fracture, body splintering like cracked glass. James was falling again. But this time, there was no floor waiting, just a mirror. And when he hit it, it didn't shatter. It accepted him. He opened his eyes. Back in the attic, the portrait above the brass plate was finished now. His face, eyes closed, mouth slightly open, like he was breathing, and behind the frame, the walls whispered, "We remember you now." And somewhere far below, the door that breathed exhaled, satisfied for the first time in years. For the first time in what felt like centuries, James sat in silence. No screams, no whispering, no shifting walls. Just silence. But it wasn't peace. It was the kind of quiet that comes after something terrible happens. Thick, echoing, raw. He stood alone in the attic, surrounded by mirrors that no longer showed him, and paintings that no longer moved. His portrait was complete, mounted above the brass plate like a tombstone. He stepped closer and stared. It was perfect. Too perfect. His likeness was rendered with a precision that betrayed no brushstroke, no sign of human effort. His eyes were closed, his head tilted slightly forward, as if listening to something deep underground. A single crack ran down the corner of the frame, barely noticeable, but pulsing with something faint and alive. It didn't feel like an image. It felt like a window, one that might open if he looked too long. James turned away. The attic didn't resist him this time. The stairs creaked gently under his weight as he descended, and when he reached the hallway, the walls were normal. For the first time in days, if it had truly been days, the hallway looked like it had when he was a child. Same peeling wallpaper, same faded family photos, same dull glow from the cracked ceiling light. The house was pretending again. And that terrified him more than the horrors he'd already seen. Because now it was playing quiet. Now it was setting the stage for something worse. He wandered the rooms with the kind of caution one uses when inspecting a coffin you suspect might still contain something alive. The living room was still gutted, portraits gone, bookshelves bare. The kitchen's bloodstain had faded, but not disappeared. The furnace door at the end of the hall was gone completely, replaced with blank wall. Whatever it had shown him, whatever it had asked of him, it was done now. So why was he still here? He didn't remember falling asleep, but suddenly he was waking again. On the floor. Not in the attic this time, but in a new place. The hollow room. That's what the house called it, though it didn't say it aloud. The name just was. It settled into his head like a fact he'd known his whole life but never realized until this moment. The room was enormous and empty, with white walls that curved upward into nothingness. It wasn't a dome. It wasn't a box. It had no clear shape, only space, endless and blank. There was no furniture, no doors, no light source, but he could see. And standing across from him was himself. Not the other James. Not the smiling imposter from before. This was him. Same clothes, same wounds, same shaking hands. The figure moved when he moved, but it wasn't a reflection. It had depth. It cast a shadow. James took a cautious step forward. So did the other. He opened his mouth. "What is this?" The other James mirrored his movement, but said nothing. Instead, it raised its hand slowly, deliberately, and began to pull at its face. The skin peeled like paper. Beneath it wasn't blood or bone. It was another face. James gasped. Stepping back, the double pulled again. The new face came away, and then another, and another. Dozens, hundreds. Each time it removed a face, a new one waited beneath. Sometimes male, sometimes female. Sometimes human, sometimes not. Some were children. Others were eyeless, noseless, mouths agape with silent laughter. Then the figure froze and dropped the pile of masks at its feet. It raised one last face and placed it on its head. His mother's. James couldn't move. The thing in front of him tilted its head, wearing her expression like an echo. Then it spoke. Not with her voice, but his own. "You remember too much." He tried to reply, but his tongue felt glued to the roof of his mouth. "You fed us well," it said, "but you're leaking." The thing stepped closer. "Now we need you to forget." A second later, James felt a pull. Not physical, not external. It came from within. A slow tug at his memories. It started with the obvious. His name, his childhood, the attic. But then it reached deeper. The scent of rain on the sidewalk outside his first apartment. The rhythm of his mother's humming. The way he felt when he first held someone's hand in 5th grade. Gone. Stripped clean. Peeled like layers of wallpaper. The walls of the hollow room shimmered, becoming reflective. Not mirrors, exactly. Memories. They played on the walls like home videos left to rot in sunlight. Glimpses of his life, fading fast. "No," James croaked. "I need them. They're mine." The thing in his mother's face leaned in close. "They were never yours." And then, light. Blinding. Shattering. James clutched his head and screamed. When the light faded, he was standing in a hallway again. But not in the house. Somewhere else. He recognized it slowly. Fluorescent lights, pale tile, a faint antiseptic smell, a hospital. Not a real one, not now, but one from memory. He heard footsteps. A nurse passed by. Didn't see him. Then another, and then her. His mother, younger, whole, alive. She walked quickly, hand clutching her stomach, worry etched across her face. James followed. She passed into a delivery room. He knew this moment. He was being born. He wasn't watching a memory. He was inside it. As the door swung closed behind her, a hand grabbed his shoulder. He spun around. The nurse was him. Older, gaunt, eyes filled with recognition and pity. "You keep feeding the house, James," the nurse said. "You keep giving it your life." "I never meant to," James whispered. "I just wanted to know the truth." The older version of himself nodded slowly. "You did. Now you know why people forget." And just like that, he was alone again. The hospital faded. The tile curled upward, the walls melted, and the hollow room returned. Only now it wasn't empty. All the faces were back, hanging in the air around him. Watching, waiting, and in the middle of the floor, the bone shard waited too. Clean. New. The walls began to pulse again. The whisper came. One word repeated. Forget. 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 And James finally understood what the house wanted. Not memory, not history, not even fear. The house wanted his identity, one layer at a time, until all that remained was a name carved into a wall, a portrait with empty eyes, and a hollow room waiting for the next one. James could feel it now, the erosion. Not like forgetting something naturally, but like someone was inside him with a dull knife, scraping away names, faces, entire chapters. And he wasn't sure what was worse, that it was happening, or that part of him was beginning to welcome it. There was a sick kind of peace to it, like the comfort of sleep after days of exhaustion. No choices, no fear, no memory. Just stillness. The hollow room pulsed around him, steady as a heartbeat, and the faces that floated above watched without emotion, observing, judging, approving. The bone shard lay on the floor again, same as before, and James knew what it meant. One more name, one more offering. This time not to escape but to vanish, to submit, to let go completely. If he bent down and carved that name, his own or someone else's, it would be the end of everything that made him a person. He would be reduced to ink in the house's ledger, filed among the others who came before, absorbed into the symmetry of the Ashford name. He knelt. His hand hovered over the bone, but then he paused. He still remembered one thing, a noise. A sharp, abrupt snap of wood breaking, not from this place, not from a memory, but real. Now, the house had flinched. He stood, quickly, scanning the faces. Their gaze had shifted, no longer fixed on him. They were all staring to his right, toward the edge of the hollow room where no wall had ever existed. And yet, there it was. A door, not breathing, not pulsing, just there. Rough wood, cracked paint, a rusted handle. A door like the ones from his childhood. He approached it slowly, cautious, disbelieving. The house never gave him options. It gave him paths, curated, inevitable, and he walked them because he had no choice. But this door felt unplanned, out of place, like a tumor in the house's perfect design. He reached out, touched the knob, cold, real. The moment his fingers closed around it, the hollow room screamed. Not the faces, not the walls, the room itself. Like it had just realized something had slipped its grip. The faces blinked in unison. The bone shard lifted off the floor and hovered behind him, trembling, vibrating violently like it was caught between magnet and metal. It wanted to be used, needed to be used. But James turned the knob. The door opened, and everything tilted. He fell through, not into light or dark, but into reality. Sudden, brutal, jarring. He hit a hardwood floor and groaned. Familiar scent, dust, paint, old plaster. He was back in the Ashford house, the real one. Somehow, the hallway stretched before him like a fossil, old and worn, the walls yellowed with age. Family photos hung askew from long, dead nails. He looked at his hands, bruised, filthy, but real, tangible. He ran, room to room, calling names he barely remembered now.
Dad!
Anyone. No one answered. But something was different. The air didn't pulse anymore. The floors didn't breathe. It was just a house now. A tired old thing that had seen too much. But then, he heard it. Downstairs, the basement. He froze. He remembered his mother's voice, fractured and echoing from that other version of her. Don't go into the basement again. But it was calling him. Not in whispers, not in songs, in his voice, repeating the same phrase. James Ashford. Come, remember. The basement door creaked open on its own, the hinges dry and brittle. No pulsing, no heat, just stairs descending into shadow. He descended slowly. The steps groaned underfoot with each one. He felt time folding around him. The air got colder, but not unnaturally so. The kind of cold that clung to memory. The kind that lived in places people didn't visit anymore. When he reached the bottom, he stopped breathing for a moment. The room was empty. No furnace, no mirrors, no children crawling from soil, just a concrete floor and a single chair in the center. On it sat a figure, his father. Alive, silent, still. James stepped closer, heart hammering. The man's skin was ashen, his eyes dull sunken, but they were focused, aware. James crouched, voice shaking. Dada, the man blinked, and said softly, they never let you go. They just let you wake up between dreams. James clenched his fists. I got out. I broke it. The old man's mouth twitched. A hint of a smile. So did I. Once. James stepped back as the truth settled in like ice in his spine. "You've been here this whole time." His father nodded. James looked around. Nothing. Just bare walls. A single chair. No monsters, no magic, no horror. Just time. Endless, quiet, dry time. "You're in the last room now," his father said. "The only one they don't decorate. The one they don't let you see unless they want to." James turned toward the stairs. The door was gone. Only wall. Only concrete. His father leaned forward. "You gave them your name. They carved it deep. You know what that means?" James nodded. "It means I don't exist outside this house anymore." His father's eyes filled with something close to pity. "And they'll call you back, over and over. You'll wear different faces. But underneath, you'll always be you." James looked down at his hands again. This time, they were aging. Fingers thinned, skin cracking, bones poking through flesh. He tried to scream, but it came out dry, hollow. He looked to his father one last time. "Is there a way to stop it?" The old man shook his head. "No. But there's one way to pause it." "How?" "You forget." The word chilled him more than anything the house had done. "I forget me." His father nodded slowly. "Everything. It's the only thing that confuses them. Wipes the page. If you can forget who you were, even for a moment, they lose track. The house stalls." James felt it, even now. The pull, the urge to remember, the urge to write. He sat down in the chair, closed his eyes, and forced the memories away, one by one. The sound of his mother's lullaby, the smell of the house in spring, the scar on his left knee, his name, his nothing, silence, peace, and upstairs in the attic, the portrait began to fade, paint flaking away, color softening, until only an outline remained, waiting. Because the house wasn't done. Not yet. It never finishes a portrait. It just waits for you to remember who you are, so it can begin again. It began again, as it always did, with a sound so soft it might have been imagined. A rustle between walls, like paper sliding across skin. The kind of noise that made the ears twitch, made the eyes narrow with suspicion, and vanished the second one tried to hear it clearly. James opened his eyes. He was standing. He didn't remember rising from the chair. He didn't remember sleeping. He didn't remember anything. That was the point. He had forced it all out. He had erased himself. Yet here he was, upright, alive, breathing, in a hallway. Not the hallway. This one was narrow. Too narrow. His shoulders grazed the walls. The wallpaper was faded and damp, curling at the edges like old leaves. Light leaked from somewhere behind the walls. Not above or in front, but from within, as though the house itself glowed faintly beneath its skin. He took a breath. It was the first thing he was sure of. The second thing was this: the house was no longer pretending to be a house. This wasn't its facade. This was its guts. He moved forward, instinctual and slow. The floor shifted underfoot, not with movement, but with memory. Every step triggered flashes: a woman crying into a sink, a man cleaning blood from his hands, a child laughing before something took the breath from his lungs. James didn't know if they were real. He didn't know if they were his. All he knew was that they came from here, from this hallway. This place wedged between fiction and fact. The walls breathed with him. The closer he walked, the more the house inhaled. It was learning him again, trying to rebuild the pieces he'd thrown away. The way a spider rebuilds its web after the storm. Quietly, methodically. Inevitably, the hallway ended in a door that wasn't a door. It had no knob, no frame. Just a flat surface, pale and pulsing, like the thinnest skin stretched over something too large to name. It beat with rhythm. A slow, deep thrum that echoed in James's chest. He didn't want to touch it, but he was already reaching out. When his hand met the surface, it wasn't like pressing against a wall. It was like pressing against memory. It gave way, sinking under his touch until the entire surface rippled. Then it opened, not with sound, but with absence. The hallway vanished behind him. The air turned heavy and gray, He was in the room between walls. No one told him that. No sign named it. But the knowledge was immediate and crushing. He had been here before, in dreams, in moments between waking and sleep. This was the room that lived in every forgotten corner of every house. The space behind the dresser that no one ever moved. The gap between two floorboards where a voice once whispered and was dismissed as plumbing. The dead space where houses held their breath. It was vast and featureless, but James could feel its layers. Like walking through pages of a book written in ash. With every step forward, another part of himself floated away, peeled gently into the fog. His laugh, the feel of grass on his palms, the sound of his father's boots on the porch when he came home late. And then he saw them. The watchers. They didn't have eyes. They didn't have mouths. They barely had shape. Just long forms, like shadows that had forgotten how to lie flat. They hovered in the edges of his vision, always just behind the turn of his head. But he could hear them thinking, not speaking. Thinking, "Why are you still walking? You gave up. You forgot. That should have been enough. You shouldn't be here, James Ashford." That name struck him like a match to dry wood. He knew that name. It belonged to him, didn't it? Yes. But why did it feel borrowed? The watchers moved closer. James didn't stop walking. There was something ahead. Something glowing. The fog parted gently as he moved toward it, and the object revealed itself slowly. A mirror, standing freely in the middle of the endless nothing. Tall, framed in old wood, cracked and gnawed as if chewed by time itself. The glass was dull, coated in a thin sheen of condensation that pulsed like breath. He stepped close and wiped the glass clean with the sleeve of his shirt. The man staring back wasn't him. Not exactly. He looked the same, but his expression was whole. Not frightened, not broken, not lost. This version of him was complete, as though he had remembered every moment of his life and found a way to live with all of it. Behind his reflection stood a house that burned but did not crumble. Rooms alive with pain, yes, but also with truth. Real memories, unflinching, solid. James leaned in. The reflection smiled, and then the mirror cracked, one sharp line, right across his face. Then another, and another, until the glass shattered inward and the fog screamed. James was thrown back. The watchers hissed, not with sound, but with removal. The fog retreated. The walls split open, and for a moment he saw the entire house, not as rooms and windows, but as memory incarnate, a structure built of moments. Every corridor a choice made or denied. Every floorboard a lie buried too deep. Every door a version of himself locked away. And at the center of it all, the portrait room. Still there, still waiting, with his name freshly carved beneath an empty canvas. Not finished after all, just paused. James stood up, body shaking. He could feel the memory returning now. Not gently, violently. The house was rebuilding him, layer by layer. Faster than he could resist, he started running. Not to escape. There was no escaping. But to reach the center before the house did. Before it could fill in the last stroke. Before it could finish the story. Because he finally understood. The only way to break the house was to remember everything. Not just what it wanted him to, but what it feared he would. And whatever that was, it was buried in the room between walls, in the space behind memory, where all haunted houses begin. James ran. The house no longer tried to twist the path beneath him. It didn't fold stairways or bend hallways into impossible curves. It didn't need to. It was done pretending. The masks were off. The stage was stripped bare. Now it simply watched, a thing too big to hide anymore. Pulsing around him with every step, walls exhaling, floors humming, ceilings sweating with age and hunger. James could feel it in his blood. That low frequency the house carried, like a forgotten song playing just under his heartbeat. He sprinted through the hallways, past memories he refused to look at. A nursery flickered into existence beside him for one step, then vanished. A bathtub filled with dark water blinked on his left. A noose spun gently in the next doorway. The house was showing him its best work, the highlights of terror, the brushstrokes of madness. But James didn't stop. He didn't speak, didn't think. He ran until he reached the attic door. It stood open, wide, waiting. The light spilling from inside was wrong. It didn't glow. It bled. A thick, golden hue that painted the stairs in warmth, but felt colder with every step up. The kind of light you'd find in a dying fire, moments before the coals turn to ash. He ascended, breath ragged, eyes focused, bones aching with memory. He wasn't afraid anymore, not in the way the house had always demanded. This fear was different. Focused, clear, not the kind that fed the walls, but the kind that made you fight back. The attic hadn't changed. Not visibly. The mirrors had returned, yes, but they were covered now. Draped in black cloth, like mourners at a wake. The air smelled of candle wax and charred paper. The wooden floor groaned underfoot, and at the center of it all, exactly where it had always been, was the wall of portraits. His was still there, but something had changed. The painting had begun to bleed. Thick, dark red seeped from the bottom edge of the frame, slow and steady, pooling at the base of the wall. The brass nameplate beneath it was no longer clean. It pulsed, just slightly, with each drip. Jam SMA Chiffo RD. It throbbed with life. James approached, and with every step the room whispered louder. Not with voices, but reminders. His mother's last scream. His father's trembling hands. The forgotten birthdays. The quiet moments he had turned away from. Every second of guilt he'd buried now rose like smoke, and the portrait drank it in, grew stronger, more vivid. The face in the painting was beginning to open its eyes. He stepped closer, and saw something that made him freeze. Behind his painted self, another figure was forming. Faint, ghostly, like charcoal smeared beneath the paint. A woman, hair matted, eyes dark. At first he thought it was his mother, but no, it was someone else. Someone older, something deeper. The first. The one who had built the house. She was being painted with him, inside him, her outline becoming clearer with every second. And then James realized what was happening. He wasn't just the house's memory anymore. He was becoming its canvas. Not a portrait of who he had been, but of what the house wanted him to be. A vessel. A new face for the oldest memory. The one that held all the others inside it. The house didn't just remember, it rewrote. He stumbled backward, stomach turning, hands trembling. "No," he whispered. "No, you don't get to wear me." The attic groaned in response. One of the mirrors clattered to the floor behind him, its cloth covering falling away. He turned. The mirror was empty. Not blank, empty. It didn't reflect him, didn't reflect anything. It was a hole. A window into a room with no walls. And then the whisper came again, right beside his ear, cold and endless. Step through. He should have run. Should have turned back, fought it, screamed. But something inside him, some knowledge not his own, spoke up. This was the only way to stop the painting. If he didn't enter, it would finish itself. And if it finished, he would be forgotten. He stepped toward the mirror, and the world folded. No pain, no noise. Just cut like a chapter ending mid-sentence. He stood now in a room that defied logic, a place between time and thought. The walls were made of memories, but not just his. Everyone's. Millions of them, projected on the surface like film reels in chaos, overlapping moments of pain, birth, loss, fear. And at the center of the room stood an easel, and on it a portrait in progress. His, still bleeding, still unfinished. But this time, the brush hovered in midair, and the one holding it was the first memory, the woman. She turned slowly. Her face was blank, but not featureless. Blank like a book not yet written. She stepped forward, and spoke in his mother's voice. "You can't stop it. You are part of it." James stepped forward. "No, I'm the mistake you made." The room hissed. She tilted her head. "You think you're different. I know I am. I remembered everything, not just what you wanted me to see. The furnace, the hollow room, the lies, the fiction. And you fed us, she said. Fed the walls, fed the silence. No, I gave you noise. James reached for the portrait on the easel. It was almost done. Just one corner remained blank, a single spot where his heart should have been. He dug into his chest with trembling fingers and pulled. The pain wasn't physical. It was truth. He pressed it to the canvas. The woman screamed, not with sound, but with absence, with void. The mirrors shattered. The attic roared. The house buckled inward. And then silence, real silence, no whisper, no breath, just stillness. He opened his eyes. He was standing outside the house. The sun was rising. The sky bled orange and pink. No one else was around. The windows were dark. The doors shut. The grass long and undisturbed. James turned away. He didn't need to look back. Because he remembered. And the house hated that. Because memory, once complete, can't be rewritten. But stories that end, they don't feed anyone. James didn't speak for hours. He walked down the cracked road that led out of Widdershade, the sun pressing gently against his back like a hand guiding him forward. The town was as empty as it had ever been. No faces in windows, no rustle of curtains, no barking dogs or rumbling cars. Just silence. But not the suffocating kind the house had kept pressed like a hand over his mouth for days. This was different. This silence had space in it. It breathed. Each step he took felt unreal, like a dream that had broken free from the sleeper and gone rogue, wandering through daylight, slowly forgetting what it once was. He didn't look back. He couldn't. Something deep inside warned him not to. Not because the house would pull him back in, but because he'd see it differently now. He'd see it waiting. Patient. Calculating. The portrait wasn't finished. Not really. He had stopped the final brushstroke, but the house hadn't vanished. It didn't collapse into rubble, didn't burn, didn't rot. It stood as it always had. And that was the worst part. It would continue, long after him, long after memory. Because the house didn't need to be alive to function. It just needed to be remembered. By the time he reached the highway, the sun had climbed high. Sweat clung to his shirt, and every muscle in his body ached. A car passed, just one, and didn't stop. A blur of metal and sound. It took him another hour before another vehicle appeared, this one slowing as it neared. A woman in her late 40s leaned out of the window, her eyes shaded by sunglasses, her mouth twisted with uncertainty. "You lost or something?" James hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, you could say that." She let him in. Didn't ask questions. He sat in silence for most of the ride, staring out the window as trees blurred into streaks and fields, rolled by like slow waves. Eventually, she asked him what he was doing out there. Just outside a town no one remembered, near a house that didn't exist on any map. He told her the truth. Every word. He didn't expect her to believe it. He wouldn't have believed it himself, just a week ago. But he told her about the rooms, the mirrors, the bleeding portrait, the other James, the breathing doors, the watchers, the hollow room, the furnace, the attic, the first memory, all of it. And when he was done, she didn't laugh. She didn't scoff. She just nodded once and said, "You got out." Most don't. That was the first time James realized something new she knew about the house. Not the name, not the specifics, but the pattern, the marks it left behind. She pulled into a rest stop after another 20 minutes. Bought him water and crackers. Gave him a number scribbled on a napkin. "If the dreams come back," she said, "call this. It's not a hotline, no one official, just others. People who got out." He stared at the napkin like it might bite him. "How many are there?" She shrugged. "More than you'd think. Fewer than there should be." James got out. She drove off, and for the first time in days, he felt the breeze on his face without thinking it was whispering to him. He sat at the bench outside the rest stop, bottle in hand, staring at the line of trees on the other side of the parking lot. People moved nearby. Cars coming and going, families laughing, someone walking a dog. and it all felt distant, like a show he'd watched too many times but couldn't remember the plot of. He looked down at the napkin. No name, just a number. He folded it once, twice, 3 times, and tucked it into his pocket. He didn't call. Not yet. Instead, he closed his eyes and remembered. Not the house, not the fear, but himself, the real James. The one who laughed at stupid movies. The one who held his mother's hand in a hospital hallway when she thought no one could see. The one who buried guilt like pennies in dirt because he was too young to carry it properly. The boy who grew into a man with too many shadows behind him. He remembered, and that was everything. Because the house hadn't won. Not really. It had taken parts of him, yes. Made him forget, made him bleed, made him create. But in the end, it had failed to erase him completely. That was its weakness. It couldn't hold what it couldn't finish. And he wasn't done yet. That night, at a cheap motel by the roadside, James sat on the edge of the bed with the TV off and the lights dimmed. The air conditioner clicked softly in the background, a steady hum that grounded him. He pulled a notebook from the drawer, found a pen, and began to write. Not names, not stories of horror, just truth, line by line, memory by memory, a list of what was real. Because if the house ever called again, and he knew it would, he wanted to be ready. Not with weapons, not with screams, but with self, with fact, with the pieces the house had failed to steal. And miles away in Wittershade, behind locked doors and blackened windows, the Ashford house sat quiet. The portrait remained on the attic wall, faded, cracked, unfinished. But its eyes were open, and it was still watching, still waiting, because the house never ends. It just pauses. It started with a smell. Weeks had passed, maybe more. Time no longer moved for James the way it did for others. He lived in quiet places now, stayed near motionless towns with flat skies and cheap motels, working odd jobs just long enough to pay for silence. He told no one his full name, didn't keep clocks in his room. He moved like a man hiding from a storm he couldn't see, only feel, because the house never truly let him go. He knew that now. It hadn't followed him. It hadn't invaded his dreams. It had done something worse. It had waited, until he let his guard down, until he started believing he was free. That's when the smell returned. Soft at first, barely there, faint and sour like old water soaked into wood, like something rotting behind a wall that no one dared to open. He smelled it in the hallway of a roadside diner, then again in the laundry room of a motel. But he didn't react. Not at first. He ignored it, forced himself to believe it was mildew or bad plumbing. But by the third night, when the scent followed him into his dreams, he knew the house had turned its head toward him again. It wasn't over. And this time, it wasn't whispering. It was knocking. He left town the next morning, didn't say goodbye to anyone, packed a single bag and left behind a cup of coffee still steaming on a table by the window. No destination, just distance. But halfway through the second state line, he saw the billboard. He wasn't sure how he could read it. The paint was old, faded, the letters warped with age, but the message was unmistakable. An IDDR Sadadi well ames weubasike. He didn't remember taking the exit. Didn't remember turning off the highway, or following the winding road past the dead trees and the cemetery with names he hadn't yet forgotten. But he did remember the feeling, the ache in his bones, the heavy air pressing down on his lungs, the distinct sensation that every step forward was being measured, as if the ground itself remembered him and was judging how hard he fought to stay away. The town hadn't changed. Still empty, still frozen, windows still dark, streets still cracked, signs still rusting quietly in the wind. And at the center of it all, like a scab that refused to heal, stood the Ashford house. Whole, alive, breathing. James stopped in front of the gate. His hand hovered above the latch. His reflection stared at him from the dusty glass of the front window. Older now, thinner, darker under the eyes. But still him, still unfinished. He stepped forward. The gate creaked open without touch, and suddenly he was inside. No transition, no walk up the path. One breath he was outside, and the next he was in the hallway again, the scent of dust and sorrow thick in the air. The walls were darker. The pictures on the wall were wrong, skewed somehow. Faces were blurred, mouths open, eyes hollow, and one of them blinked. James kept walking. The house didn't twist this time. It opened. Room by room, door by door. Every place he had ever stepped, every moment he had buried, laid bare and waiting. He passed the kitchen, now filled with dishes no one had eaten from. The living room, empty but echoing with laughter that wasn't real. And then, the stairs. They led upward now, not to the attic, to something else. He climbed. The steps gave way to something that felt like sky. Open, wide, endless, and yet there was no wind, no stars, no moon. Just a vast black canopy above, filled with names, glowing softly like constellations, endless, floating. And in the center of it all, suspended above the floor by nothing visible, was his portrait. Still cracked, still bleeding, still unfinished. A single brush hovered beside it, waiting. James looked down. He was standing not on floorboards, not on stone, but on glass. Beneath it, he could see all the versions of himself the house had tried to create. Dozens of lives lived in nightmares, twisted and discarded when they failed to satisfy its hunger. He saw himself as a priest hanging from a bell rope, as a child trapped in a closet with no air, as an old man rocking in a chair that was on fire, whispering the names of people who never existed. Every one of them wore his face. Every one of them fed the house. And now, once again, the house was hungry. A voice echoed across the space, not whispered, spoken. "You return, James. You always return." He didn't answer, because deep down he knew it was true. He hadn't come back to end it. He'd come back because the story had never finished. Because his portrait still waited. Because some part of him needed to see it done. The voice continued. "You can step away again. Forget, if you choose. But you'll never be free. Not while the painting waits." He looked up at it. The version of him in the frame was older now. It had changed in his absence. The eyes were hollow but searching. The mouth slightly parted like it was about to speak. And behind the figure, just beginning to form in the painted background, was the house. It was painting itself back into him. James reached out, touched the brush. It burned. Not with fire, but with memory. The memories he'd scraped away, buried, silenced. They came flooding back. Not just the horrors of Ashford House, but everything before. His mother's face on the morning she left. The sound of his father's fists against the table. The night he tried to run. The days he forgot on purpose. The brush pulsed in his hand. The portrait shimmered. He could finish it. He could end the waiting. But the moment he lifted the brush, he saw something in the glass beneath his feet. A crack, hairline, small, but growing. It spidered across the surface like frost on a window, reaching the edge of the platform. And then he understood. The painting wasn't the final step. It was the trap. The final stroke wouldn't end the story. It would lock it. Forever. James let the brush fall. It shattered. The house screamed. The black sky shattered into shards of mirror. The names blinked out, and the portrait burst into flames without burning. The voice howled. "You fool! You will never forget now." James stood tall, watching the fire twist into a shape he recognized. Not his face, not his name, but something underneath it all. Something ancient, the first memory. He smiled. "I'm counting on it." The glass beneath him gave way. He fell. But this time he chose to, because some stories don't get sealed in frames. Some stories burn their own endings, and leave the house hungry, forever. James fell like a man being unmade. No gravity, no wind. Just downward, through layers of memory, through time pressed flat and cold, through everything the house had carved into him. But this time, the descent felt different. Not like he was being swallowed or punished. It felt like escape. Like pulling the curtain down on a stage, that had played the same tragedy for centuries. He wasn't running anymore. He was removing himself from the story. And the house hated that. It howled as he fell, not with rage, but with hunger. A deep, ancient keening that shook the walls of the place beyond Widdershade. It wasn't screaming for James. It was screaming because James had refused to become its final line. The portrait was gone. The brush was broken. The ending it had built him toward for so long had slipped through its fingers. He landed without sound. The floor beneath him was dirt again. Cold. Damp. He was in the basement, but not the one he remembered. Not the furnace room. Not the place of jars and children's hands clawing through soil. This was something older, the true foundation. The roots of the house, they stretched out around him like petrified veins, thick and cracked and winding in patterns that didn't follow any sense of architecture. The air buzzed with memory. Each root pulsed with stories, forgotten lives, tragedies invented and consumed. The house had fed on them all, some real, some imagined. It didn't care which. As long as they tasted of fear, James walked. The roots throbbed as he passed, whispering fragments of the lives they held. A little girl named Elsie who vanished down a laundry chute. A man named Carter who was buried beneath the front porch and never found. A family of 5 who smiled at breakfast and screamed in unison at midnight. So many stories, so many names, but none of them finished. That's what James saw now. Every memory in this place, every echo, every fragment was incomplete. Just enough to torment, just enough to sustain. The house didn't want closure. Closure was starvation. It needed endless loops, cycles, portraits left unfinished so it could keep feeding, keep remembering. It wasn't a house at all. It was a parasite, and James was the first one to ever cut the cord. He moved through the roots until he found the core. He didn't know how he knew it was the center. He just felt it. A chamber shaped like a perfect sphere, covered in mirror, like bark. In the middle stood a pedestal, and atop it, a book, not the journal from before. This one was bound in leather that moved when you looked away from it. He approached. His reflection in the walls showed him flickering versions of himself. Smiling, weeping, screaming, dying. And through it all, one truth remained: the house never forgot. But now it was starving. James reached for the book. The second he touched it, the voices rose, screaming, pleading, offering. The house threw its best at him: promises, lies, bargains. It offered him his mother, whole and smiling, arms open, his father, alive and proud, a life untouched by tragedy. All he had to do was write, just a few lines, just a memory. But James understood now. Every story he gave it, true or false, was another thread wrapped around his throat. Every fear he named gave it shape. Every word gave it blood. He didn't speak. He didn't write. He tore the book in half. The scream that followed cracked the mirror walls. Roots thrashed around him. Dust rained from the ceiling. The entire foundation began to collapse inward. But James didn't run. Not this time. He knelt, pressed both hands to the floor, and whispered, not a memory, not a fear, his name. Not the name the house had carved into a brass plate, not the version painted in oils. His real name, James Michael Ashford. The one his mother whispered into his hair on the day she thought she was going to die. The house choked on it. Because truth had weight, and the house only knew shadows of it. The roots turned black, not burning, rotting, withering, shriveling into dust beneath his fingertips. The air cracked open with the sound of splitting timber, and above him, he could feel the walls of Ashford House begin to collapse. Not theatrically, not explosively, quietly. Like a body giving out after too many years of holding in pain. It didn't die screaming. It died empty. James rose and walked through the falling silence. The attic shattered above. The hallways folded inward. The portraits burned without fire. And the foundation split wide, swallowing the rooms it once protected. When James stepped outside, the house behind him wasn't there anymore. No rubble, no debris, just the empty lot. overgrown grass, a swing set long rusted, swaying in wind that had finally returned. He looked up at the sky. Clear, wide, real, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he didn't hear his name whispered behind him, because the house was gone, and with it, its hunger. James stood there until night fell. Then he turned and walked back down the road from which he came, hand in his pocket, fingers wrapped tightly around a folded napkin with a phone number he hadn't yet called. But maybe now he would. The napkin was soft with wear. James had unfolded and refolded it so many times that the ink was starting to fade. It had been in his pocket through storms, through nights in train stations, through motel showers and long walks across nowhere towns. Yet somehow the number remained legible, just barely, as if whatever was written there wanted to stay, as if it wasn't quite ink, not entirely. He sat on the edge of a motel bed in a town that didn't even show up on gas station maps, staring at a payphone bolted into the wall across from the ice machine. He hadn't picked it up yet. Not since the day the woman gave him the number. Not through all the time he'd felt the weight of the house pressing on his spine. Not when the smell came back. Not even when the portrait had begun to bleed again. But now the house was gone. Ashford House had collapsed into itself like a bad dream. No burning, no flood, just disappearance. An ending so absolute that it had left behind nothing but an overgrown lot and a ghost breeze. James had walked through it with his eyes open and his breath held, waiting for the trick, for the twist, for the walls to regrow, for the nameplate to gleam again in the attic light. But nothing came. The house had starved. He had made sure of it. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had stayed. Not the house, but its echo. James stood up and walked to the payphone. He slid the napkin from his pocket, smoothed it, stared at the number. His finger hesitated over the keypad, then dialed. The line clicked once, then twice, then silence. No ring, no tone, just air. He almost hung up, and then a voice, calm, warm, tired, said, "How long were you inside?" James didn't answer right away. The words stuck in his throat. He hadn't spoken about it since it ended. Not in full. Not out loud. Finally, he said, "Long enough?" The voice on the other end let out a slow breath. "You remember your name?" "Yeah," James replied. "Good," the voice said. "That's the first test. Is this a joke?" "No," the voice replied. "But the house you were in, it might have been." James felt a chill brush his ribs. "What do you mean?" "There are houses," the voice said slowly, "and then there are copies of houses. The real ones don't just trap people, they learn from them. They replicate themselves, change shape, try on new faces. When you burn one down, the memory doesn't always die with it." James sat down hard on the floor, hand tightening around the receiver. "You're saying it's not over. I'm saying it might never be," the voice answered. "But there are others like you, others who got out. We can't kill it, but we can keep each other from falling back in." Silence passed between them. Then, "What's your name?" James hesitated. He thought of the portrait, the bleeding frame, the attic's quiet breath, the book he tore in half. Then he said, clear and steady, "James Michael Ashford." The voice on the other end didn't respond for a moment. Then, "Welcome back." A click. The line went dead. James sat there, staring at the receiver in his hand. His reflection peered back at him from the chrome panel next to the phone. He looked hollowed out, aged past his years, but he was still there, still him. He folded the napkin one more time, tucked it into a notebook this time, not his pocket, and began to write, not about the house, not yet. That was too big, too alive. It would come back on its own terms. But he started with the things it couldn't eat, the things it didn't understand. Truth, names, connections that didn't bloom from fear but from choice. He wrote down the name of the woman who'd picked him up. He wrote down the faces he remembered in the hallway, people who'd become portraits. He wrote down the first meal he ate after getting out, and the first moment he realized he could laugh again. He wrote all the things that would starve the house if it ever came back. And far away, beyond the edge of the map, something moved. Not a house, not yet, but a foundation. A space between walls, waiting, and it remembered him. But it wouldn't know where to begin. Not until he did. Not until he gave it a name. James stopped dreaming. Not because sleep had finally become peaceful, but because whatever once waited for him behind closed eyes now stood just outside his waking world. Watching, waiting. The dreams hadn't ended. They'd simply shifted, become external, lingering on the edge of his vision. In the static between radio stations, in the flicker of motel lights that hadn't flickered before. He knew what it meant. The house was gone, yes. But the memory of the house wasn't. And that's what it had always wanted to be. An echo loud enough to rebuild itself. It started small. A crack in the wall of a gas station restroom, shaped just slightly like a doorway. A mirror in a diner that showed a version of him with older eyes. A child in a parking lot, sitting alone on the curb, whispering to something that wasn't there. James told himself they were fragments. Leftovers. That what he'd done in the foundations had been enough to starve the original. But even ash can carry sparks. Even ruin can be reused. And he had left too much behind. His name, his story, his fear, it was all fuel. He checked into a new motel outside of Amarillo under a different name. Simon Halloway. One of the names he remembered from the jars in the furnace room. It felt like an insult to the house. Like using its own dead against it. The woman at the front desk didn't question him, though she gave him a look that lingered too long. Like she recognized something in his face she couldn't place. Like she remembered him from somewhere. Room 3C was quiet. At first, he laid his bag on the dresser, peeled off his boots, and sat on the bed, eyes on the ceiling fan spinning slow circles. He didn't intend to sleep. Not really, but silence is a trickster. It stretches, it wraps around you, and eventually it convinces you to let go. When he opened his eyes again, it wasn't dark. It was gray. A soft, ashen tone had swallowed the room. Every surface was dull, faded, washed in the same lifeless hue. And in the corner, the wallpaper had peeled away. Just slightly, a sliver, enough to see what was beneath. Brick, flesh-colored, beating. James rose without thinking, breath sharp in his lungs. He pressed his hand to the peeling edge. It was damp. Warm, like breath pressed between skin and plaster. He tugged the paper back and saw it again. The pattern. Those same spirals and circles, etched faintly into the wall. The house's birthmark, its blueprint, its signature. But this wasn't Ashford House. This was new. And that was the worst part. He hadn't returned to the house. The house had returned to him. Rebuilding itself, cell by cell, beneath cheap carpet and motel wallpaper. It wasn't architecture. It was infection. And now it was using his memories to build walls around him again. Each crack in the ceiling, each shadow that lingered too long, each door that suddenly creaked even when closed. He stepped into the bathroom, heart thundering. The mirror was covered in steam. He hadn't used the shower. He wiped it clean and saw nothing. No reflection. Just a blank wall where his face should have been. Then, writing, appearing slowly as if being traced from behind the glass. "We remember how you built us." His hands shook. He backed out of the bathroom, palms pressed to his sides, eyes scanning the room. The window was gone. The TV hissed with static. The doorknob pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat. It had begun. The new house. The echo. But this time, it wasn't rooted in a place like Wittershade. It was portable. It carried itself in the minds of those who'd escaped. In their retellings. In their trauma. In their writing. He had fed it with every note in his notebook. Every spoken word to someone who believed. Every line he scribbled in motel drawers and rest-stop paper towels. It hadn't died. It had scaled down. Made itself leaner. Faster. Viral. James turned in a slow circle. The room was shrinking. not physically, but emotionally. The kind of narrowing that made the lungs ache and the skin itch. The kind of spatial wrongness that only existed in haunted houses or bad dreams. He grabbed his bag, tore the napkin from the notebook, dialed the number again. It rang once, then twice, then the same voice. "Where are you?" "It's rebuilding," James said, voice not gone. "It's smaller, smarter." The voice didn't hesitate. "Get out. Do not stay another night. It's already inside," James whispered. A long pause. Then burn it early. Before it spreads. James stared at the walls. The spirals had grown. There were names in them now. His, yours. The voice continued. "There are others who know. Who've seen the signs. The echo is picking up again. We're mapping the pattern. You just confirmed the third location." "I'm a location now?" he asked, laughter edging into madness. "You're a host," the voice said, "but not for long if you want out." Then the line clicked dead. No goodbye, no plan, just urgency. James dropped the receiver, went to the desk, and began tearing the room apart. He ripped out drawers, tore the mattress open, shattered the mirror with a lamp, slashed the wallpaper with his car keys. He wasn't searching for anything. He was removing it, refusing to let it root, refusing to give it the silence it needed to grow. And when he left, he didn't look back. He walked until sunrise. And when the motel burned down that afternoon, James didn't stop moving. Because he knew something now. Ashford House hadn't been the first. It had only been the most complete. And somewhere out there, between forgotten roads and cracks in memory, the echoes were gathering, waiting for someone to name them. The echo spread quietly, the way rot always does. Not with thunder, not with fire, but with suggestion. A crack here, a flicker there, a hallway that suddenly stretched longer than it should, a closet that creaked open when no one was near it. By the time someone noticed, it wasn't a haunting anymore. It was a habitat. And James, more than anyone, understood the danger of that kind of familiarity. The house didn't need to invade. It just needed to blend in. He traveled west this time. Not because he had a plan, he didn't. But because the voice on the phone had mentioned, mapping the pattern, and that word stuck in his mind like a splinter. It made the house feel like a disease, something airborne, something that needed vectors and survivors to spread. He wondered how many others had survived like him. How many had gotten out just to realize they were still in it. He found himself in Arizona, middle of nowhere, a dead town with a name even the locals didn't seem to use. He walked past abandoned storefronts, sat on benches overgrown with moss, and watched as crows gathered on rusted swings. There were signs of life, sure, gas stations, a bar with one working neon light, a grocery store with fading labels, but they all felt incorrect, as if the town were wearing someone else's skin. At night, he stayed in a crumbling bed and breakfast that had once been a funeral home. The rooms were long and narrow. The floors were too soft, and there were too many doors for the space inside. The owner, a thin man with cloudy eyes, didn't ask for his name. Just handed him a key and said, "Don't open the back closet after 2 a.m. James didn't ask why. He already knew. That night he didn't sleep. He sat by the window, watching the sky press down on the town, wondering how much longer he could keep ahead of the echo. His notebook lay open beside him, not filled with memories anymore. Now it was filled with sightings, sketches, coordinates, crude diagrams of staircases that ended in brick walls and maps of cul-de-sacs that didn't appear on Google. Each one felt like a pre-house, a place warming itself before fully forming. And the next morning, something new appeared. Taped to his door, a page torn from a book. No handwriting, just printed words, crisp, clean, TCCOBR not T first, no name, no sender. Just that single sentence, and a red spiral scrawled across the corner in ink so thick it bled through. James stared at it for a long time. He knew it was a warning. but it felt more like an invitation. He checked out without a word, walking into the desert on foot. The further he got from roads, the more the silence began to shift. It wasn't just quiet, it was expectant. As if the world itself was holding its breath. He found an old firewatch tower just past dusk, climbed it, sat in the small shack at the top with a broken radio and windows covered in dust. From that height, he could see too far. Houses dotted the desert like teeth, not real ones, reflections of them. Some looked familiar, Ashford-style architecture, long chimneys, too many windows. Others were new domes, stone bunkers, sunken buildings barely visible above the sand. They didn't belong, none of them. And they were spreading. He felt it. Felt it the way he once felt the house move beneath his feet, like a shiver in bone. He pulled the torn page from his pocket again and stared at the spiral, and then he did something reckless, something desperate. He copied it, carefully, line by line, into his notebook, and the second he finished the last curve, the desert wind stopped, dead still. Not a single sound, not even breath. And then, in the static hush, the notebook began to warm. A shape bloomed beneath the page he had written on. A map, no names, no cities, just landmarks, empty fields, dead trees, burnt churches. A network of absence, arranged in circles that looped outward, wider and wider, all spiraling around a center point. James traced it with his finger, right to the middle. No label, just a blank space. But he recognized it. Of course he did. Widdershade, the original mouth, and suddenly he understood the pattern. The house hadn't been built in Widdershade because of cursed ground or ancestral sin or rituals. Widdershade had been chosen because it sat on a crack in the world, a place where memory frayed, where stories didn't finish, where echoes nested. And now the nest had broken open. He closed the notebook, climbed down from the tower, and began walking back toward the center. Not to destroy it, not yet, but to name it. Because if there was one thing the house feared, more than fire, more than memory, more than escape, it was being seen clearly, being called out, being drawn. He would map the echo, he would write it down, and when the time came, he would read it aloud to others like him, and starve it again, not with silence, but with truth. Widdershade wasn't on any map. It hadn't been for years, maybe decades. Ask too many questions about it, and you'd start getting looks, first confused, then unsettled. Like people had heard the name once in a fever dream, or on a radio broadcast just before it cut to static. James had learned that the hard way. Now, as he stood at the edge of the invisible line where forest met absence, he felt something more than dread. Not fear, not quite, but a weight, like air made of water. The kind of pressure that settles in the chest before a storm, the kind of silence that has teeth. The town was still gone. Not ruined, gone. Buildings reduced to impressions in the grass, roads that ended in dirt. An empty clearing where the Ashford house had once stood, now overgrown and listless, as if the earth itself had tried to erase its memory and failed. James stepped into it without hesitation, feet crunching over weeds and forgotten stones. The sun shone directly overhead, yet the shadows clung to him like oil. He wasn't alone. He knew it before he saw her. She stood at the far end of the clearing, facing what used to be the front porch. Pale coat, black boots, short gray hair that shimmered like ash. When she turned to him, there was no shock, no fear, just recognition. "You made it back," she said. "You left me a number," he replied. "You called it?" They stood in the space between what was and what still wanted to be. No names, no questions. Not yet. There was a rhythm to these kinds of meetings, an invisible line between survivors that only they could see. "You've seen the map?" she asked. He nodded. "It showed itself when I drew the spiral." "They always do," she said. "That's the hook. The shape that lets it bloom again. The story that doesn't end." James reached into his bag and pulled out the notebook. She didn't look at it. She didn't have to. Instead, she reached into her own coat, and produced something wrapped in twine. A bundle of pages, yellowed and curling. "I've been collecting them," she said. "The spirals, the stories, the sights, they're all part of the same thing. A moving house. A roaming echo. It doesn't stay dead, it relocates." "Is there a way to stop it?" he asked. She gave him a look that wasn't cruel, but it wasn't kind either. "No. Not forever. You can burn it, bury it, starve it. But you can't kill what feeds on forgetting. It's older than brick, older than story. It's not a place, it's a pattern. And it keeps rebuilding itself in people who carry unfinished memories." James opened his notebook. "Then what are we supposed to do?" She smiled faintly, and it was the saddest thing he'd seen in months. "We'll remember." 2 more figures stepped into the clearing. A tall man with a limp and eyes that didn't match, and a woman wearing gloves in the middle of summer. Survivors, like him. Their names didn't matter. Not now. What mattered was that they'd made it out. What mattered was that they still carried pieces of the house, but refused to be rebuilt by them. Together, they walked to the center of the lot. No altar, no grave. Just space, empty and waiting. The woman in the gray coat knelt and began pulling items from her satchel. Bits of metal, charred nails, glass shards, scraps of old journals, all leftovers from other echo sites. All tainted by memory, she arranged them in a circle. "We hold a vigil," she said. "Not for the dead, but for the unwritten. We speak the names of what we lost. Not to feed it, but to mark it. To close the page it's still trying to keep open." James hesitated, then pulled a photo from his wallet. It had survived too much. Water damage, fire time. It barely looked like anything now, just 2 smudged figures on a porch. His mother and father, younger, before the house, before the forgetting. He placed it in the center. "I remember them," he said. The others began to speak, each offering a name, a story, a memory that once belonged to the house, but now belonged to them. The moment was quiet, but not empty. It pulsed with something that felt strangely holy. And for the first time, James felt the hunger shrink, not vanish, but pull back. Retreat starve. He realized then what had always been true: the house didn't fear fire. It didn't fear escape. It feared community. It feared witnesses. Because once a story is shared fully, honestly, named, it becomes something else. It becomes history. And history cannot be rewritten, not without resistance. As night fell, the group lit a single lantern and left it at the edge of the lot. A signal to anyone else still running, still remembering, still unfinished. James didn't know where he would go next. None of them did. But they'd stay close now. They'd call the number again. They'd answer when it rang, because the echo was still out there. But so were they. And the house would find it much harder to build again in places where people knew each other's names. Night in Widdershade felt different now. Not haunted, hollowed. The clearing where Ashford House once brooded was just grass and earth and memories speaking in the hush between wind gusts. Around the lone lantern, James and the others sat in a loose circle, each clutching some object saved from their own stories. Relics that should have belonged to nightmares, but instead anchored them to reality. For hours, they spoke in turns. No drama, no performances. Only truth, names of those they'd lost, places they'd fled, things they'd carried out of burning rooms and waking dreams. Each memory was offered not for the house to swallow, but to finish. To leave it with nowhere else to go. The fireflies came, blinking along the tree line, and the town's silence grew almost companionable. James listened as the tall man described a farmhouse in Nebraska where the wallpaper bled every night at midnight, or as the woman with gloves recited the address of a place that never existed on any map, but haunted her mailbox anyway. Each story built a wall, not to keep the house out, but to keep themselves in, to stay whole. Yet as the hours passed and the night deepened, something old stirred beneath the ground, a hunger that couldn't stand to be left out. The echo was still there, alive without walls, searching for a way to take root. Not a house anymore, just a need. For unfinished stories. For people too scared or too proud to tell the truth to anyone but the dark. James felt it brush against him, gentle as a spider crawling across skin. It wanted his voice, his pain, his loneliness. It wanted him to start another secret, another lie, another silence. That's what it fed on, the gap between what was remembered and what was confessed. But the circle held. For the first time, he understood why survivors gathered like this, why the number on the napkin was never answered by the same voice twice. Because the echo wasn't just a haunting or a curse. It was a function of isolation, a thing that starved when people spoke, when they finished their stories in the hearing of others, when they marked the end and let grief become history. The group grew quiet as dawn approached. They dozed or watched the stars, the lantern guttering in the slow wind. James sat with his notebook open, pen idle, listening for anything from the house that might slip through. A whisper, a vision, a pull at the edges of his memory. But nothing came. No name in the darkness, no unfinished portrait, no voice in the walls. The hunger was houseless now, forced to drift between places, forever searching for gaps to settle in. Old wounds left untended, shame left unspoken, names left unwritten. He looked at the others, their shapes silhouetted in the blue of coming morning. None of them would ever truly be done with their stories. That was the truth of it. The echo was patient, and the world was full of cracks. But together, they were harder to feed on. Together, they had edges the house could not soften. When the sun finally rose, they packed what little they'd brought and scattered in different directions. Never saying goodbye, just nodding, understanding. James walked away from the clearing, past the lantern, feeling lighter than he had since he'd first walked up the steps of Ashford House. He followed the road until the town gave way to wild fields and broken fences. And in every footstep, he felt the echo pulling at him, testing his seams, searching for a place to build. But he kept walking, humming softly to himself, holding on to every word spoken that night. Because a story shared can be finished. A name spoken can be safe. And a house without walls, without silence, without secrets, was just hunger. And hunger, left unfed, would have to find somewhere else to go. There is a sound memory makes when it tries to escape, a distant rush, like ocean waves beneath the floorboards, insistent and relentless, scraping away at whatever stands above. James heard it as he walked. Long after the clearing and the lantern and the circle of survivors had fallen away behind him. He kept to the back roads and overgrown paths, boots sinking into mud older than any map, his notebook heavy in his coat pocket. It was too early to believe in safety, and too late to pretend he hadn't changed. There was no going back, not truly, but something inside him dared to wonder if, with each story told, with each name spoken and each vigil held, the echo might finally thin out, might finally lose the thread of him in the weaving of others. But hunger is patient, and stories have deep roots. It began with rain, not the gentle drizzle that softened edges and blurred the world into dream, but a rain so thick it felt solid, a wall of water that turned roads to rivers and fields, to shallow seas. The clouds above pressed down, swollen and unbroken, holding a light that never reached the ground. By dusk, every shape was shrouded, every shadow deepened into something with depth and intent. James found himself moving slower, each step a negotiation with the world as it gave way beneath him. His destination was nowhere, and yet he felt himself drawn south, toward the towns whose names were only rumors, toward places that didn't appear on any map, toward the promise of dry ground and the lie of shelter. He came to it at the end of a long night, the house that waited, not Ashford House, not one of the echoes, something new, or perhaps something older, a relic that had waited for the world to forget before it revealed itself again. It sat at the end of a flooded road, its porch half drowned, its windows flickering with the kind of candlelight that should have been snuffed out by the storm. The building was small, hunched low to the earth, the wood gone black with age and water, but its door was open, and the light within reached out like a hand. James paused at the edge of the porch, the rain pooling around his ankles, the water licking up the steps as if it too wanted inside. He should have kept walking, should have turned back, or at least circled wide and found another path. But exhaustion and hunger, and something quieter, a sense of unfinished business, pulled him forward. He stepped onto the porch. The boards sagged beneath his weight, the whole structure groaning, as if it was surprised to carry a living soul again. Each step he took was swallowed by the hush of the storm. Inside, the air was thick with candle wax and salt. The room was small, lined with chairs and empty frames hung crooked on the walls. Everything here was worn down, but not abandoned. Kept, as if waiting for someone to come home and finish what had been started. James's eyes adjusted to the gloom, and he saw them. Other travelers, 3 in all, sitting in silence around a table in the center of the room. They looked up as he entered, their faces marked by rain and old scars. A woman with a limp, her hair tied back tight. A boy barely 20, his hands shaking as he cradled a cup of cold tea. An old man with a beard gone gray and wild, his eyes sharp and unblinking. They watched James with the calm of people who had seen the echo before, who knew what it could do and what it could take. "Come in," the old man said, voice soft, as if afraid to wake something sleeping beneath the floor. "There's always another chair." James sat. The woman nodded to him, and the boy offered a faint, brittle smile. The old man poured another cup of tea, hot now, though James hadn't seen any fire, and pushed it toward him. "We tell stories here," the woman said. "It's the only thing that keeps the water out." James looked at the rising flood outside, the porch now almost submerged. "What is this place?" "A heaven," the old man replied. "But only for the night. By morning it'll be gone. Or maybe we will. Depends on how well we remember." James looked around at the empty frames. "Who are they for?" The boy spoke, his voice thin and careful. "People who never told their stories. The ones who vanished. They're waiting for names," the woman added, glancing at the wall. "Names and endings." James looked at the candle flame flickering on the table, its light steady despite the draft. "And if you finish the story." The old man's eyes sparkled. "Then the water leaves you alone. For a while." James listened as the others began to speak. Each story was a shard of glass, sharp, true, unfinished. The woman spoke of a house by the sea that sang every time the wind changed, and the child she lost to the tide. The boy told of a cellar door that grew heavier each year until it could no longer be opened, trapping his brother on the wrong side. The old man recalled a church with no windows, only mirrors, and the congregation that disappeared after a single midnight service. James felt the room lean in, as if the house itself was hungry for these confessions, but the others spoke with a clarity that cut through the echo's desire to devour. They spoke to finish, to seal, to end, not to feed. As each tale was told, the water outside seemed to recede, the porch emerging inch by inch from the flood. When it was his turn, James hesitated. He didn't want to speak the name Ashford, didn't want to invoke the house that still stalked his memory in spirals and blood and mirrors. But he could not refuse. He spoke quietly, hands folded around his cup, and told them what he had survived. He spoke of the hollow rooms, the breathing doors, the painting that bled, the attic that sang with names, the vigil in the clearing, and the hunger that never truly left. As he spoke, the house shifted. The frames on the walls filled, each one slowly resolving into a portrait, a woman standing by the ocean, a boy at the bottom of cellar stairs, a man holding a broken mirror. And in the last, James saw himself, older, thinner, with a face that seemed to both remember and grieve. When he finished, The others nodded. The old man leaned back and sighed. We keep each other real. That's all we can do. James nodded, looking out the window. The rain was slowing, the water falling away from the porch as if repelled by the light within. For a moment, he felt a strange, deep relief. Not freedom, never that, but something close. A break in the tension, a breath between storms. They stayed until dawn, dozing in turns, sharing stories when the silence grew too thick. When the sky lightened at last, the house seemed smaller, the walls closer, the candles guttering as if reluctant to see the sun. James rose with the others. The boy was first to leave, stepping out onto the porch, now dry and firm. He paused, then turned back. You'll find more like us, he said, voice stronger than before. Keep telling it, even when it hurts. The woman followed, limping but steady. She squeezed James's hand as she passed. It's not over. But it's not just you anymore. The old man smiled, the lines on his face deepening. Go while you can. Don't wait for the water to rise. James lingered a moment in the empty room, staring at the frames on the wall. His portrait remained, but the eyes seemed clearer now, less haunted, more awake. He stepped onto the porch, felt the sun touch his face. Behind him, the house groaned, shifting its weight, and he heard the faintest echo of the ocean under the floorboards. Waves pulling back, hunger receding. The door shut behind him with a soft click, and when he turned, the house was gone. No foundation, no steps, only a patch of grass, slick with dew. He walked away, each step lighter, and for a moment he believed, truly believed, that the echo could be kept at bay. That the hunger, denied its secrets and given only finished stories, could be made to starve or at least retreat. The road ahead was long, and the map in his notebook grew heavier with each new name, each new ending, each vigil that closed a chapter for someone else. He would travel as far as the story carried him, seek out every porch where survivors gathered, and refuse the silence the house demanded. Because every night, somewhere, another door would open. But as long as there were names spoken, stories finished, and rooms where the echo was not welcome, there would be hope. And that was the promise of the drowned porch, a place between storms, where hunger came to listen and left empty, a place where memory, once shared, could not be stolen, a place where the house, if only for a night, was finally locked out. James walked away from the vanished house with a strange ache in his chest, something like loss and relief tangled together. The sun was up, pale and watery in the storm's wake, but the world felt rinsed clean, sharp around the edges. He trudged on, boots caked with mud, his notebook heavier in his pocket. The road curved through empty fields where the mist lifted off the grass like tired ghosts, and, for a time, nothing haunted him but his own tiredness. Even so, the echo's pull never truly faded. Every silence felt suspicious. Every distant bird call made him turn, half expecting to see some impossible door or figure from the story that refused to die. It was another small town that drew him next, so nondescript he couldn't recall its name even as he entered it. He kept his head down, not from shame but habit. He scanned the faces of strangers, looking for the same haunted mark he'd learned to recognize, that flicker in the eyes, that slant of shoulders, the way survivors carried their weight like a shield. Here and there, he caught it. A woman watching him from a laundromat window, a teenager lingering too long at the end of a grocery aisle, an old man on a porch staring at nothing with ferocious intent. They all looked away when James glanced back, but he knew the signs. He checked into a small motel and spent the afternoon watching the clouds. Each one reminded him of something. Water stains on attic ceilings, the splay of candlelight on damp wallpaper, the first uncertain shape of a breathing door. He tried not to dwell on it. He tried to hold on to the lesson of the drowned porch, finish what you remember, share it, name it, and move on. But some memories didn't want to close. Some pages in his notebook fluttered at the edge of sleep, desperate for more. That night, a storm rolled back through, all thunder and wind, hammering the windows and shaking the roof. James sat with the lamp on, writing everything he could, his own stories and fragments of others he'd gathered along the way. He wrote until the pen ran out, then switched to another, filling pages with names, endings, places left behind. He wrote until the echo in his bones eased, just enough that he could sleep. Dreams crept in, sly and half familiar. He was a child again, walking up a staircase that never ended, every step creaking a different note. He passed doors that pulsed in the dark, each one marked with a single name he could never quite read. At the top, a window let in moonlight, so sharp it bled onto the floor. His own reflection waited there, hands pressed against the glass. He tried to speak, but no sound came. Instead, the reflection mouthed words he could almost understand. "You can weather this. You just can't hide from it." He woke before dawn, sweating, the taste of thunder still in his mouth. The storm had passed. The world outside was glistening and bright, and for a moment, James felt almost normal. He showered, dressed, packed his bag, and left the room without looking back. He stopped for coffee at the gas station, and when the cashier handed him his change, her fingers lingered over his palm. She looked him in the eyes, and there it was again, that flicker, that old pain. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. As he walked out, James realized the world was full of these silent exchanges now, brief, electric, unspoken. Not every survivor held vigils or drew spirals or mapped the echo's hunger. Most just tried to weather it, to carry on, to keep the unfinished from taking root, and each one mattered. Each was a stone in the path, a shield against the next house, the next story. He followed the road west, then north, stopping when he pleased, turning aside when the pull got too strong. He met others, sometimes in passing, sometimes in circles that gathered at dusk to speak their truths. Some stories ended in laughter, others in tears. Some were left open, unfinished, waiting for another night, another porch, another storm. James learned to recognize the signs of an echo gathering, a sudden coldness in the air, a spiral etched into playground concrete, the way a door seemed to breathe when no one was near it. He grew better at finishing his stories, and at helping others finish theirs. He grew better at weathering. The hunger never vanished. Some nights, when sleep came light and fitful, he heard it lurking outside his window, a hollow sigh, a scrape of nails on wood, a whisper of his name. But it never got in, not when he held to the truth. Not when he kept the stories finished, the memories spoken, the names written down. Seasons changed. The world rolled on. Fields went from green to gold to bare, and then back again. James kept walking, kept writing, kept sharing the story. The echo chased him. Sometimes close, sometimes distant, but he never walked alone now. The memory weathered him, shaped him, made him part of something larger than the house or the hunger. And each time he met another survivor, at a bus stop, in a library, under a freeway bridge, they'd share what they could. Sometimes just a nod, sometimes a name, sometimes an entire night of stories by candlelight. The echo would pull at them both, gnawing for unfinished pain, and each time, together, they would withstand it. Because the hunger could be weathered, if not defeated, because every memory finished, every truth named, was another storm endured, and with every season, the echo's power faded just a little more, thinned by the community of the remembering, outlasted by the stubbornness of those who refused to be silent and would not let the house return. James turned a page in his notebook, wrote down the date, then closed his eyes and, just for a moment, let himself rest, confident that even if the next house tried to rise, he and those like him would be ready. That the memory, though scarred and sore, could stand against whatever storm tried to follow. Because the story was not the house's anymore, it belonged to those who survived, to those who remembered, to those who weathered. And that, more than anything, was what kept the hunger at bay. James walked on, moving further from the drowned porch, and the last place the echo had dared take shape. Each new town was both a test and a promise. A threshold he crossed on foot, always bracing for the unseen weight of the past to drag at his shoulders or catch in his throat. But as the days stretched and the world pressed forward, the ordinary returned in stubborn, beautiful fragments. It was in the roadside diners with chipped coffee cups, in the quiet hours spent in a library's back corner, in the laughter of strangers who'd never glimpsed a breathing wall or heard their names whispered from empty rooms. The ordinary was everywhere, and sometimes it felt like the only true magic left. He made himself small in these places, sat at the end of the counter, paid in cash, smiled at the right times, kept his stories simple. But even as he learned to live among people who hadn't been marked, James found himself watching, always watching, for another sign, another survivor, another faint tremor of unfinished memory that would reveal the echo circling just beneath the world's skin. Sometimes, he saw at a newspaper headline about a vanishing, a sudden house fire that left nothing but foundation and rumors, a new spiral chalked onto the sidewalk outside a thrift store. It was never blatant. It was never enough to draw anyone else's notice. But he saw it, and he knew. The echo still hunted for cracks to enter, still sent its roots into places where stories remained unwritten. But there were fewer cracks now, every time he met another like him. A woman at a Greyhound station, tracing a spiral in condensation on the window. An old man who whistled the tune James had heard once in the hollow room. They would exchange a look. Sometimes words, sometimes not. Sometimes they would share a meal, sometimes just a few minutes of quiet presence. It was enough. With each connection, the threshold of the ordinary grew thicker, harder for the echo to pass through. James learned to appreciate things he once took for granted. The taste of cold water after a long walk. The way sunlight pooled on the tile floor in a borrowed kitchen. He sent postcards to nowhere, addressed to his old self, signed with names he'd carried and cast off and reclaimed along the way. He wrote in his notebook daily, sometimes long confessions, sometimes just a word or two. Safe, he'd write, or night, or remembered. The act of writing was a shield, one he could hold up against the silence when it pressed too close. One morning, in a small city whose name he instantly forgot, James found himself sitting in a cafe as rain traced patterns on the window. He watched a young couple argue softly over a crossword puzzle, an old woman knitting in the corner, a child with a spiral drawn in blue crayon on her sleeve. For a moment his breath caught. But the child just laughed, tugged by her mother out into the street, the spiral nothing more than a doodle. The world was not haunted here. Not now. The echo watched, always, but it was not strong enough to make anything more than shadows and small mistakes. He realized, with a slow and grateful dread, that this was the threshold, the place between horror and healing, between being marked and moving on. Here, memory could be an anchor, not a chain. The stories still mattered. He still wrote them down, still whispered them in circles, still stood vigil for those who could not. But he no longer lived inside them. He no longer bled each time he remembered. The echo had to work harder now, had to look for lonelier hosts, for cracks in families and empty houses where silence reigned. He left the cafe and walked in the rain, hood up, letting the chill soak through to his skin. He paused in a small park, watching children chase pigeons, and thought of the attic's portrait room, of bleeding walls and breathing doors, and realized he could remember without feeding the hunger. He could walk this threshold, neither haunted nor blind, a bridge for others to cross when their turn came. By evening, James had reached another roadside inn. He checked in, scribbled a note for the next traveler in the drawers. "You're not alone. Don't forget your name," and slept without fear. In the dream that found him, he stood on a porch somewhere between rain and sunlight and someone. Maybe himself, maybe another, closed the door gently, smiling. In the morning, he woke to a world still turning, the ordinary stubborn as weeds. He kept moving, because this, too, was survival, not a battle, not an ending, just a daily crossing of the threshold, story in hand, memory in the open air, and the echo kept waiting outside, hungry, patient, and, for now, unwelcome. Days folded into each other, and for a time James felt almost invisible, drifting through cities and small towns, letting the ordinariness of the world cushion his mind. The hunger receded, weakened by every finished story and every name spoken aloud, but James knew better than to trust it was truly gone. The echo changed tactics. It had patience, and patience breeds cleverness. It didn't roar or pound at the walls of his days anymore. It watched, waited, seeped in where the light was thin and the routine most comforting. He first sensed it in the window glass, a presence, not a reflection. In some motels, the mirror showed him younger than he was, or caught his eyes moving out of step with his body. But it was the windows that made him uneasy. How? At dusk, he'd feel something leaning in from the dark, watching with a hunger that had learned restraint. One evening, in a borrowed apartment above a hardware store, James sat by the window with a cup of stale coffee. Neon from a sign across the street blinked against the glass, making everything a shifting red and gold. He watched people move through the puddled light below, shoppers, a couple fighting quietly, a teenager balancing a pizza box on one hand. Ordinary lives, safe, or so it seemed. The glass showed only their shapes, not their faces. Only the surface. That was all any of them wanted to see. But the longer he watched, the more the feeling grew, the sense that something watched him in return. Not from the street, but from the glass itself. Sometimes it was a shape in the corner of his vision, a ripple, a second pair of eyes. Sometimes it was subtler, a shiver down his spine, a memory not quite his own brushing his thoughts. The echo was learning. It understood now that fear alone wasn't enough. It wanted recognition, a glance, a moment of doubt. He tested the window, touched it, breathed on the cold pane, and watched the fog of his breath bloom and vanish. He saw nothing unusual in his reflection, no second shadow, no stranger's face. But when he stepped back, the cup in his hand trembled, a ripple in the coffee that didn't match his pulse. That night, as rain pattered the glass, James dreamed of standing on the porch of a house that was never his, with windows all around him. He pressed his face to one and saw not the night outside, but another watcher inside. A boy, a woman, sometimes himself, each caught in an endless act of looking back. The watcher's gaze was never angry, never desperate, just waiting, as if hoping he'd make the first mistake. He woke to gray dawn, the city slow to stir. In the kitchen, he found a note slid under the door. No handwriting, just a typewritten line. "They're hungry for your eyes now." James stared at it, a chill needling his spine. But he didn't throw the note away. He kept it. Filed it in his notebook beside all the other warnings. All the other stories that tried to slip from memory's grasp. The day went on, and James stayed alert. He kept his curtains closed at night. He avoided reflective surfaces when he could. He learned to look without being seen, to walk softly in rooms that felt too empty. Yet for all his caution, the watcher lingered. Sometimes in the shifting glare of a window, sometimes in the glass of a bus shelter, sometimes in the puddles that lined city streets. Always waiting, always patient. He tried to share the feeling at the next gathering. At a church basement vigil, he described the watcher, the way the glass seemed to breathe, the way memory bent and twisted around a pane. Others nodded. One man described a mirror that showed him futures he never lived. A girl whispered of a window that wept whenever she tried to forget her sister's name. Each story closed a door, finished a line, gave the hunger one less place to feed. But even in that comfort, James felt the watcher's focus, sharpened by every retelling. He left that night and walked for hours, the city lights blurring in the wet streets. When he stopped to rest at a bus stop, he caught his own reflection in the glass, tired, wary, but present. He wrote his name on the fog with a fingertip, a defiance, a spell, James. The echo recoiled, thin as mist, forced back by the simple act of self-recognition. That was the answer, at least for now. Not to break the glass, not to hide from the watcher, but to face it and name himself. To finish the story even in the smallest ways, a word on a window, a truth spoken before the night was over. Because the echo's hunger was endless, but its patience could be starved. And James, in every room he entered, kept his name ready, written, spoken, remembered, no matter who or what might be watching from the dark beyond the glass. Sometimes the hunger comes quietly. Sometimes it arrives in pieces, like a bad smell under the floor or a familiar tune played just off, key on a distant radio. But sometimes, when memory is thin and the world is tired, it comes all at once. That night, the hunger came with the storm. James knew the signs. The wind turned mean, dragging cold across the city with a growl. Power flickered, and the neighborhood lost its familiar shape. Streetlights sputtered. The world felt unstitched, shadows sliding loose, puddles reflecting rooms that couldn't exist. James's building shivered with every gust. The old glass rattled in its frame, and even the pipes moaned like someone remembering pain. It was the kind of night when doors were locked for reasons no one could name, when even laughter sounded like something running scared. He tried to outwait the storm. Pacing his small apartment, he lit candles and wrote in his notebook, his pen moving faster as the wind howled. He wrote names. He wrote every story he could finish, even ones that weren't his, just to keep the echo from finding cracks. He made tea, called the vigil number, heard only static. He texted other survivors, received silence or a clipped, still here. Everyone was bracing. Everyone felt it. Just before midnight, there was a knock at his door. He froze, pen gripped tight. The knock was deliberate, 3 slow raps. The echo's rhythm. He waited, breath shallow, the old fear alive in his bones. Another knock. He crept to the door and peered through the peephole. No one. Only darkness in the hall. He should have turned away. But the hunger feeds on unfinished stories, and there is nothing more unfinished than a door left unopened. James unlocked it. The hall was empty, but the storm seemed louder now. Wind spiraling down the stairs. Rain drove at the windows at the end of the corridor, and for a split second, James saw a reflection, his own face in the glass, but older eyes dark and strange. He slammed the door and locked it. The wind pressed against the building, and somewhere above, a window shattered. Glass hit the alley in a rush, the sound sharp as a scream. James grabbed his notebook, wrote D.O., not open, across a blank page, and pressed it to the inside of the door. He retreated to the center of the room, candles guttering, and pulled the curtains tight. He could still feel the watcher in the window, hungry, patient, lurking at the edges of memory. The echo circled his building, probing for weakness. It didn't need an invitation. It just needed a gap, something unfinished, something left unsaid, a truth denied, a story silenced. He thought of the others. Scattered across the city and the country, all of them likely bracing against the same storm. Each one holding fast to finish stories, scribbling names, lighting candles, refusing to be silent. He wondered how many would last the night. How many would forget just enough to let the echo inside? How many would see something in the glass and reach out, desperate to finish their story in the reflection? The candles burned lower. The wind found a gap in the kitchen window and sang through it, high and thin, a note that drilled into his skull. He pressed his hands over his ears and hummed a tune from childhood, trying to drown it out. But the hunger knew the tune. It hummed with him, in counterpoint, filling the room with unfinished melodies. At 1:15 a.m., the power surged and failed. The building went black, except for James's small circle of candlelight. He listened for footsteps in the hall, for the scrape of a chair on the floor above, for the quiet click of the doorknob turning by itself. Instead, he heard whispering, a crowd of voices just beyond hearing, just behind the walls. They were all telling stories, unfinished. A woman confessing her guilt before the line cut out. A man whispering his name into a phone that never answered. A child calling for a mother who never came. Each voice rose and fell, caught in an endless loop, hungry for an ending, desperate for release. James knew the echo was drawing them all together, making a feast of memory, weaving new walls out of every half-told tale. He tried to ignore it, but the hunger found another way in. A memory surfaced, his father, sitting on the porch in the rain, staring at a letter he never mailed. James had asked what was wrong, and his father had just shaken his head. There are things you never finish, Jamie. They finish you. James tried to let the memory go, but it stuck. He'd never asked about the letter, never read it, never learned what story it tried to tell. The echo pressed hard against this gap, this old silence, and the watcher in the window seemed to lean closer, fogging the glass with its own breath. The room began to change. Walls stretched, shadows swelled, the corners curled in on themselves. The watcher's eyes multiplied, dozens of them pressed to the glass, blinking in perfect rhythm with the storm's pulses. James wrote in his notebook, names, endings, everything he could, but the page wouldn't accept the words. The pen scratched, but nothing stayed. The story was slipping away. He stood, pacing, searching for another way to finish what had begun. He found a photograph on the shelf, one he'd kept hidden. It showed his family on the front steps of a house he barely remembered. His mother laughing, his father silent. James, small and grinning, unaware of what waited. He pressed the photo flat, whispering each name, each moment he could recall. He tried to speak an ending for the man on the porch, the letter never sent. He tried to finish it with forgiveness, with understanding, with words he wished he'd spoken. The watcher leaned back. The storm eased, if only for a moment. The voices in the walls quieted, listening. James kept speaking. He finished every memory he could, every small story that surfaced. He closed every page in his notebook, said aloud every name. The hunger grew frantic, clawing at the glass, swirling in the wind. Shadows darted across the walls, desperate for a crack, for something left undone. A sudden bang rattled the apartment. The front door shook, and the word, "unsettling," said, scrawled itself in condensation across the window. The hunger was angry now, denied its feast, forced to reveal itself in the open. James stood firm, voice hoarse, repeating the names, the stories, the endings. His own name last, James Michael Ashford, survived, remembered, finished. The watcher howled. The echo thinned. Outside, the wind faltered, the storm spent. Rain slowed to a patter. The city's lights flickered back, one block at a time. The building shivered, then stilled. The pressure eased. The hunger withdrew. James slumped against the wall, breath shaking, candles guttering to nothing. The window was just glass again. The room returned to its old, cramped self. The notebook, heavy in his hand, felt full and final, the pen trailing ink across a blank page. Dawn came slow. Orange light spilled across the floor, painting over the night's scars. James opened the curtains, let the sun in, and watched as the watcher faded, leaving only his own reflection. Tired, yes, but whole, he cleaned up, dressed, and stepped into the world. The city was quiet, but alive. Cars passed. People hurried to work. A woman walked her dog past the front stoop, and the dog paused, looked up at James, and wagged its tail. The day was ordinary. No spirals, no voices, no unfinished stories. James walked to the corner store, bought coffee, and sat outside on a bench in the new morning. He took out his notebook and read through what he'd written. Finished stories. Names with endings. Memories given shape and voice and closure. The hunger could return, maybe would in another form, in another place, for another person. But here for now it had no power. not over him, not over those who had learned to close their stories before the night was through. He left a note on the bench for the next survivor. Finish it. Say the names. Write the ending. Then he walked on, ready for the day, certain that the hunger would have to look elsewhere for unfinished business, and that he, at least, had learned to survive the night. Because no echo, no watcher, no storm is stronger than the memory that endures, finished and shared and given to the light. And so long as he remembered that, he would never be alone, and the house, whatever form it took, would always find its hunger denied. After the storm, the city felt emptied of menace. Sunlight turned broken glass to jewels on the sidewalk, and the faces James passed each carried a sleepy peace, a peace hard earned, even if most would never know what they'd been spared. He carried the calm with him as best he could, moving through the ordinary morning as though the night before had only been a nightmare. But in the marrow of his bones, James knew better. He had faced down the watcher, named every unfinished memory, survived the echo's wildest hunger. But shadows always lingered in the corners of his days. He left the city by bus, notebook in hand, unsure of his next destination but clear on his purpose. If the echo wanted cracks, he would fill them. If the watcher wanted unfinished stories, he would make endings of everything. At a rest stop somewhere between cities, he saw a message scrawled in black marker on a bathroom wall. Don't let it in. Say the last word. The letters looked fresh, the ink not yet faded, and beside it was the faintest spiral. Someone else had passed through. Someone else still fought. The road west led him into smaller towns, quieter places. The pace was slower, the hunger's reach less certain. But still he saw signs. A spiral in a bus shelter, a window that gleamed too brightly at dusk, a story half finished on the lips of a stranger. In a diner, he met a woman who wiped her hands nervously on her apron. When he left, she pressed a folded note into his palm, for the days when you can't remember the end. Call if you need to. Another survivor. Another link in the chain. Nights were safest in numbers, and James gravitated to circles when he could, sharing coffee and stories in back rooms and empty churches, sometimes in parks with only the moon as witness. The stories varied. Some were new, others ancient, echoes of older houses and forgotten names, but each was finished in the telling. Each memory closed a door. Each ending became a stone on the path, something for the echo to trip over. The watchers, denied their meal, faded like old stains, but James still felt their longing at his back. The hunger adapted. Shadows passed closer now, thin and clever, slipping through old habits. On the worst nights, James found himself standing at thresholds he didn't remember crossing, holding keys that didn't fit any lock he owned. He'd blink, and be on the porch of a house he'd never seen before, the air thick with the threat of unfinished business. It would have been easy to step inside, to let the hunger try again. But he knew better. He turned away. He spoke his name out loud and strong, and walked into the night with his story intact. One evening, while camping by a lake with other survivors, he met an old woman with eyes like blue marbles. She listened to his story and nodded, saying, "Why are bridges, not walls? The echo can't build where we stand together." Later, as the fire burned down to embers, she drew a map in the dirt, a network of crossings and names, a promise that they were not alone. James copied it into his notebook, marking every town, every contact, every place where stories had been finished, and the hunger left unsatisfied. The passage of shadows became his ritual. Every morning, he greeted the light. Every night, he finished a story. In each place, he left a mark, sometimes just a word, sometimes a name, sometimes the spiral, always closed. And in this way, the echo became smaller, more desperate, forced to seek out the loneliest cracks. James saw it in the eyes of strangers, sometimes the urge to hide, to forget, to leave something unsaid. He offered them endings. Sometimes they accepted, and the weight lifted. Sometimes they turned away and the hunger circled wider. As weeks passed, the world grew softer, kinder at the edges. Children played on sidewalks where once only shadows lingered. Doors no longer breathed at midnight. The watcher in the window became just a trick of light. James slept better. He ate more. He laughed, awkward at first, then freer. The ordinary returned, but it was a new ordinary, one he'd earned with every memory finished and every shadow passed by. Yet even as he felt the echo weaken, James understood it could never be killed, only starved, only kept at bay by vigilance and the stubborn grace of community. He didn't stop moving, didn't stop gathering names and endings, didn't stop building his own small map of safety across a haunted country. He saw the hunger's last tricks. One more unfinished letter in a mailbox. One more stranger who seemed to know his name. One more house standing at the end of a street that had never been there the night before. Each time, he refused to enter. Each time, he spoke the last word and moved on, and so James became both witness and shield. A passage for others, a keeper of endings. As long as he walked, the echo would have to chase him, always a step behind, always starved for the taste of unfinished memory, because the story now was his to finish. And with every page closed, every name spoken, and every shadow left behind in the daylight, James wrote his own ending, one the house could never change, and the hunger could never claim. The highway rolled out beneath James's feet like a long gray scar, splitting towns and cornfields, threading through forests where fog gathered in lazy columns every dawn. He walked or hitched rides, never lingering, but always marking each new place with a small act of remembering a story told, a name written in chalk, a nod shared with someone who carried their own silent burden. The echo's hunger faded with distance, but James knew it was never far behind, just dulled, stretched thin, forced to pick at old wounds and forgotten corners as more survivors learned to finish their stories and share their truths. He carried his notebook everywhere. It had grown swollen with pages' names, endings, sketches, scraps of half, remembered nightmares that he forced himself to resolve in ink before they could fester. Sometimes he felt haunted by the very act of remembering, the way every new survivor he met handed him another piece of the long puzzle, another shard of a house that had tried for so long to write its own legend in the silence of the world. But each story was a wall the echo could not cross, a closed door, a window left open to the sun. Every survivor added to that barrier, sometimes knowingly, sometimes just by stubbornly refusing to forget. In Indiana, he found a truck stop where the walls were covered in graffiti, hundreds of names, spiral patterns, drawings of keys and doors and lanterns. Some were desperate, some defiant, a living testament that the echo's reach was failing here. James spent an evening at the counter, scribbling his own name on a napkin and watching a teenager etch another story into the plastic laminate. No one spoke of the hunger directly, but when the power flickered and everyone held their breath, he saw the recognition in their eyes. They were learning, all of them. The watcher at the window had less power, in a place where laughter echoed against the walls and nothing was left unsaid. He moved on. Sometimes he traveled with others. Two women in a battered sedan who traded ghost stories as easily as cigarettes, an old preacher who recited parables of unfinished business and doors that would not close. James listened and offered what he could, but always kept his own tale honest, his own memory finished before the night was through. He learned the difference between hiding and surviving. One shrank the world. The other made it wide enough to share. A chill crept into the air as summer turned. On a rainy morning in a riverside town, James found himself caught in a funeral procession. He stood respectfully aside, hat in hand, but when the mourners passed, one woman stopped and looked him in the eyes. "You helped them move on," she asked quietly, as if the phrase had meaning only the haunted could share. "I try," James said, voice gentle. "I helped them finish." She nodded, pressed a slip of paper into his hand. For the ones still waiting, it was a list of names, some crossed out, some not. James folded it into his notebook and felt the echo tremble, hungry and denied yet again. He saw more spirals, more messages. Tell the ending. Don't go silent. Stories keep us whole. The road itself felt alive, patched with the hope and the pain of everyone who had survived, everyone who had lost something to the hunger, and then refused to feed it again. James added his marks, never the same twice, a sketch, a name, a date, a whispered confession under his breath before sleep. Yet sometimes, in the late hours, the echo tried again. A roadside motel with a door that wouldn't lock. A diner where the mirror behind the bar clouded with breath and showed him not himself, but the hollow eyes of the man he might have become had he never finished his story. Shadows still flickered at the edges of the world, but now he could see them for what they were. Thin, desperate things, sustained by old secrets and new fear. He met a child in a park outside Des Moines who asked him, out of nowhere, "Do you remember the house?" James knelt, smiling softly, and answered, "I remember enough." The boy nodded and returned to his game, and James wondered how many generations would bear the scars, how many would need to be taught the power of an ending. By autumn, his notebook was nearly full. The country behind him had grown brighter, lighter, less heavy with dread, not free, never free, but open. He joined a vigil in a firelit barn one cold night, 20 survivors standing in a loose circle, each telling the one story the echo had tried to take. Each one finished, and when they left, someone carved a new spiral over the door. Closed. This time, the end connected back to the beginning. James left his boots on a fence post as a marker for the next traveler, walked barefoot through the grass, and felt the world turn gentle underfoot. He knew he would never stop moving, not until every unfinished story found its way to light. The road that remembers is a long one, and every name spoken is a mile gained. As he watched the sunrise from a lonely hill, he promised the echo that it would never know peace, not so long as even one survivor remembered, finished, and passed on the gift of truth. And somewhere, in the quiet dawn, James understood he was no longer just escaping a house, or a hunger, or a watcher in the dark. He was building something in the ruins, a place where memory could rest, where endings were honored, and where the road itself would carry his name, finished and free, into every new morning. The days shortened, and with them the nights grew sharper, full of that particular hush which only comes when a year is dying. James followed the old state roads now, finding comfort in their forgotten bends and quiet towns, each place like a small pocket of safety sewn into the wide and hungry dark. He felt the echo thinning, stretched so far it was only a shudder in the wind, a smudge in the reflection of a store window. Even so, he kept vigilant, kept moving, kept listening for the one thing the hunger could never counterfeit, a story told to its end. Somewhere in Nebraska, as the first frost claimed the grass, he found the telling place, a church that had lost its congregation to time but gained, in their absence, a new purpose. It wasn't advertised. The stained glass was broken and the steeple had collapsed, but the doors were always open, and the basement was lit by lanterns, the air thick with the soft hum of voices. Survivors gathered here, sometimes dozens, sometimes only 2 or 3. Each one came burdened with their own unfinished shadows, but none were turned away. James arrived near midnight, feet numb, notebook thick as a brick. He stepped into the circle of chairs in the flickering light, and a hush fell. Some faces he recognized. Travelers from the vigil, from the drowned porch, from roads crossed in other, darker towns. Others were new, their eyes wide, haunted, hopeful. In the center of the room, an old tin box sat atop a battered table. Each person carried something to place inside: a letter, a trinket, a torn page from a diary, a key with no lock. James found himself clutching the slip of names given to him, by the woman at the funeral, and after a long moment, he dropped it in. One by one, they told their stories. The rules were simple: tell it true, finish it, speak the names. No one interrupted, no one judged. No one let a memory trail off into silence. As the hours passed, the air grew warmer, layered with the strength and sorrow of every memory made real. A boy who had once lost weeks inside a house, with no clocks, told how he found his mother again by singing her name at sunrise. A girl who'd seen her own reflection blink. When she did not recited the day, she finally covered the mirror and slept through the night. An old man, hands shaking, spoke softly of a door he never opened, and the wife who waited behind it until he learned to say goodbye. James listened. And when it was his turn, he spoke his own truth again. Not just the horror of Ashford House, but the long road after, the hunger that wouldn't die, the peace found in small endings, the power of walking with others who understood. He finished the story in a way he never had before, his voice steady, the echoes outside the old church fading with every word. At dawn, the box was closed and set back on its shelf. The survivors embraced, some weeping, some laughing, all a little lighter than when they'd arrived. Outside, frost glazed the grass, and the first crows called across the fields. James lingered at the steps, breathing deep the air that no longer smelled of dust or regret. He watched as others went their own ways, spreading out across the land, each carrying a piece of the story to be told elsewhere. The telling place would not last forever. Already the world was changing, the echo learning, the hunger adapting. But for that one night, they had built a sanctuary not of walls, but of words. Every memory finished, every name spoken, every silence broken was another stone in the foundation of safety they made together. James pressed his hand to the church door, a silent thanks, a mark for the next who needed to find it, and stepped onto the road again. The sun rose behind him, and as he walked, he hummed the old tune from the hollow room, not with dread, but with hope, each note a promise that the story could end as many times as it needed to. The echo still followed, but quieter now, starved and uncertain. The world felt wider, full of people brave enough to share, wise enough to finish, stubborn enough to listen. Every place James visited became a telling place for a night, every campfire a vigil, every story a weapon against the dark. And for the first time since Ashford House, James believed, not just in escape, but in return, in healing, in the simple, fierce power of the finished tale. As winter pressed close, James felt the world itself slow. The air thinned, the sun hung low and weak, and most of the travelers he'd met along the road turned their faces homeward, wherever that might be. There was a sense of letting go, of drawing inward, a kind of peace, or at least a pause. For the first time in years, James allowed himself to imagine what it would mean to settle, if only for a while. He found a small town nestled between two ridges, a place with no stories attached, no spirals in the concrete, no houses that watched from the corner of the eye. He rented a room above an old bakery, and the first night he slept so deeply he barely remembered dreaming. Days found their own rhythm. James woke early, swept the snow from the bakery's steps, accepted coffee and simple bread from the woman who owned the shop below. He spent afternoons wandering the town's short streets, hands tucked in his pockets, nodding at strangers who didn't know his name and never asked for it. He wrote letters to the survivors he'd met. Some went unanswered, others brought brief replies full of gratitude or news from far-off places. The notebook stayed on his table, mostly closed. Memory began to soften, growing gentler with each finished story, every name that had found its rest. But in the evenings, when the wind whistled against his window and the world pressed in, James sometimes found himself thinking of the house. Not Ashford House, not the drowned porch or the echo's endless hunger, but the quiet house. The one he imagined now with no spirits or shadows, only soft light and the creak of old wood as it settled. He wondered what it would feel like to live in such a place, to fill a room with warmth instead of fear, to let memory shape the space without haunting it. For so long, he had carried the knowledge that stories left unfinished could devour a life from within. Now he wondered if stories finished, spoken, shared, could instead become a kind of shelter. He tested the idea. Left his window slightly open at night, letting the air move through the little room. When dreams came, they were quieter, rooted in ordinary days. A walk to the post office, laughter with the baker's daughter, the sound of rain on the roof. Some part of him was always watchful, but the echo was thin now, stretched too far to do more than murmur. He woke each morning intact, carrying no new shadows. He became part of the town in small ways. He helped shovel snow for an old man who'd lost his cane. He fixed a fence for the grocer, painted a bench at the park. Children began to wave at him, then run to show him their drawings. A house with a red door, a family standing in bright sunlight, no windows watching from the dark. The hunger couldn't root itself here, not with so much laughter, not with so many stories finished before sleep. Sometimes James still felt the echo trying, searching for a crack, a silence, a name left unspoken. On those nights, he'd light a candle in the window, write a short memory in his notebook, or simply say his own name aloud. James Michael Ashford, he'd whisper, the sound settling in the room like dust. Each act of remembrance was a closing of a door, a gentle refusal. The quiet house became real in those moments, more real than any haunted room he'd ever fled. Winter deepened, snow piling high, but James felt rooted, if only for a season. He knew the echo would always exist, hungry for stories left half told, but here, in this quiet house, he learned what it meant to be more than a survivor. He learned to live. And every morning, as he watched the town wake from his window, James promised himself that as long as he drew breath, he would carry the finished stories forward. Not just to keep the hunger away, but to make a home of memory, a place where the past could rest, and where no one need be haunted by unfinished tales ever again. Winter's grip eased slowly, and with it, the days began to stretch open, carrying a feeling of gentleness James had nearly forgotten existed. He let himself grow comfortable in the rhythm of the quiet house above the bakery, mornings with fresh bread and friendly laughter, afternoons filled with small acts of kindness around the town, evenings spent watching light fade through old glass as he wrote letters or finished his tea. For the first time, the notebook that had once been his shield felt more like a diary, a place for joys as well as old wounds. The echoes were quieter, as if even they recognized that there was no room for hunger where so much peace had settled in. He found himself talking more with the baker, Mrs. Hewitt, and with her daughter Lucy, who asked shy questions about the world outside their valley. He never shared the darkest parts of his story, but he didn't hide from them either. Lucy drew him pictures of bright yellow houses with gardens and cats, sometimes. James drew his own, simple sketches of rooms filled with sunlight and books, doors always open, laughter drifting down the hallways. The drawings became their own kind of conversation, a promise that some homes did not have to be haunted, that a house could be filled with warmth instead of silence. As the snow melted, word came from a traveler passing through another survivor. This time a young woman from the coast had arrived in town looking for a place to rest. James found her at the library, sitting in a patch of sun, her eyes scanning the shelves as if searching for a title she'd forgotten. He introduced himself gently, and when she heard his name, relief washed over her. "They said you would understand," she whispered. "They said you could help me finish it." She carried her story like a wound. A tale of rooms that shrank and hallways that shifted, of a family that never spoke what needed saying. It wasn't Ashford House, but it was the same hunger, the same unfinished ache. James listened without interruption, nodding when she faltered, holding her gaze steady when the fear tried to steal her words. And when she finished, when she named the memory that had hunted her, he offered her what he'd learned. Closure isn't forgetting, he told her. It's the gift you give yourself when you refuse to let silence finish the story for you. Together, they sat at a little table in the library and wrote the ending she needed. She wept, quietly, when it was done. James wrote her name in his notebook, then hers, then his own, closing the page with a line beneath. Finished. Safe. The echo, if it tried to linger, found nothing to root in. Word of this quiet ritual spread. A young man with a stutter, an old woman who had lost her sister, even a few children who had heard bad dreams. They all found their way to James, not for answers, but for the space to speak, to finish, to be heard. Each time, James offered the same gift: to listen, to write it down, to close the page together. And each time, the echo grew thinner, less certain, shrinking to little more than a nervous shiver at the edge of thought. Spring came, carrying wildflowers and birdsong, and the quiet house blossomed with it. James planted seeds in window boxes, painted the walls a brighter color, let Lucy fill the kitchen with drawings. The bakery's bell rang out every morning, and James felt, for the first time, not just safe but happy. Evenings became a time for stories told aloud. Funny ones, sad ones, old ones brought to light for no reason other than the pleasure of their telling. Sometimes he still caught a shadow lingering in a window or felt a familiar tension when the wind rose at night. But now, he had tools. Memory finished, names spoken, the gift of closure offered freely. The house was no longer just a refuge, it was a promise, a new kind of inheritance, a place that could shelter others not just from the hunger, but from the loneliness that gave it shape. One day, He would ask James why he wrote so many names in his notebook. He looked at her and smiled, realizing how far he'd come. Because every story deserves an ending, he said. And every ending is a gift. He meant it, and he knew then that he would keep sharing that gift for as long as he could, wherever the echo tried to rise. The hunger might never die, but it could always be denied. And in the quiet house, with friends and laughter and stories finished at last, James found the greatest peace, the gift of closure, given and received, again and again, until the world felt almost whole. As spring flourished, James found himself drawn each day to a sun-filled corner of his rented room, where the late afternoon light always seemed reluctant to leave. He would open the window, breathe in the bakery's warm scent, and watch dust motes swirl in lazy constellations across the wooden floor. It was a simple ritual, but it became everything. A time to reflect on the path behind him and the unlikely peace that had taken root in his life. There was a sacredness to this hour, a hush that wasn't silence but presence, as if all the closed stories and finished memories found a place to rest in the golden air. He wrote there, most days, sometimes long letters to distant friends, sometimes a line or two that captured the heart of the afternoon. Light lingers here, he wrote once, and felt the truth of it echo through the boards and the walls. The room was ordinary, yet every day it became more his own. The scars of the past, the watcher's eyes, the echo's gnawing hunger, the endless houses he'd left unfinished, were distant now, shadows lost beyond the reach of sunlight and shared laughter. Others noticed the change. Lucy and Mrs. Hewitt often found excuses to join him near the window, talking about their day or reading books aloud while the room filled with that honeyed glow. When the young woman he'd helped to closure visited, she brought new friends, travelers passing through, each with a ghost story or an unfinished ache. They gathered in the light, and it became a haven, no longer just for James, but for anyone needing a safe hour to finish their tale and feel themselves returned to the world. It was in this golden room that James realized how much the echo had changed. No longer a howl at his back, it was now more like a distant memory itself. A warning, a lesson, but not a threat. The hunger only found power in darkness and isolation. Here, where light lingered and voices overlapped, and no secret was left to fester, it had nowhere to root. Sometimes a visitor would hesitate, caught by an old fear, but the room's warmth was contagious. The act of telling, of listening, of writing names and endings in the open air, these became the rituals that locked the door tight. James saw it in small ways. A child's nightmare soothed by sunlight and a gentle ear. A stranger's trembling hand stilled as they read their story aloud for the first time. Even his own sleep grew deep and undisturbed, and when dreams came, they were bright and free. Full of voices he loved, places he'd helped save, houses with windows open to the world. It wasn't perfect, grief lingered, some wounds closed more slowly than others. But the darkness, when it came, never stayed long. The room was stubborn in its brightness. And so James made a practice of keeping the window open, even when rain tapped the sill, even on evenings when clouds bruised the sky. He wanted the light to linger for as long as possible. Wanted everyone who passed through to know what safety felt like. Not just the absence of fear, but the presence of welcome, of closure, of ordinary hope. He filled the space with life, borrowed plants from Mrs. Hewitt's kitchen, Lucy's crayon murals curling up the baseboards, stories pinned to the walls, souvenirs of finished tales left on the old dresser. Sometimes he'd catch himself humming the tune from the hollow room. But it was just a song now, stripped of its menace, softened by memory. The echo, when it pressed at the window, found only laughter and sunlight waiting. It would linger a while. Old habits die hard, but then it would move on, seeking shadows and silence elsewhere. James sometimes wondered how many others were building their own rooms of light. How many quiet houses were slowly, stubbornly outlasting the hunger across the country. He liked to believe there were many. When dusk came, and the sun slipped away, James would sit with the others as the lamplight grew, and the bakery's warmth rose through the floor. He'd read aloud from his notebook, finished stories, new beginnings, reminders that every darkness had its ending. And as they listened, the quiet house above the bakery glowed with a peace that no echo could breach. James knew this peace might be borrowed, that one day the world might pull him away again, that the hunger would wait for any new silence or unspoken name. But for now, in this room, where light lingered and stories finished, he had found what he'd searched for all his life, not just survival, but a home. And that was a story even the oldest house could not rewrite. Morning came early to the town in spring, soft and certain, spilling golden light through James's window before he was fully awake. Each new dawn was a quiet victory, a gentle assertion that the world, despite its shadows, was more stubborn than the hunger that haunted its cracks. He rose each day to the scent of baking bread and laughter downstairs, the promise of small, ordinary joys that slowly rewired his heart. If nights still brought a flutter of unease, the mornings always countered it, reminding him that light, like memory, could be patient and persistent. He found himself, for the first time in years, looking forward to things, the way Lucy would burst into the kitchen, with a new drawing to pin on the wall, the quiet satisfaction of sweeping snowmelt from the stoop, the warmth of Mrs. Hewitt's smile as she handed him a cup of coffee. Even the notebook on his table had changed. Where once it brimmed with warnings, lists of names, frantic retellings, and hastily closed stories, now it bore the evidence of a different, kind of living, gentle observations, hopeful sketches, odd bits of poetry that made Lucy giggle. On certain mornings, people would gather in the bakery's back room. Travelers, locals, the few other survivors who passed through, each drawn by the rumor that this was a place where stories ended safely. They'd eat, share their burdens, and, if the mood was right, allow James to guide them through the ritual he'd made his own. Sometimes it was as simple as helping someone find the courage to write their secret on a slip of paper. fold it tight, and toss it in the stove's morning fire. Sometimes it was a longer process, a story spoken and reshaped, a name remembered and spoken aloud, a trembling moment of forgiveness, a sigh of release. He realized the hunger had never truly wanted stories. It wanted incompleteness. It fed on regret, on words swallowed, on fear left unnamed. Here, in the bright breath of morning, such things were harder to keep hidden. James saw it in their faces: relief, yes, but sometimes sorrow too. A grief that was gentler for being shared and didn't need to echo in the dark. The survivors didn't always stay, but when they left, they seemed taller, steadier, ready to carry the finished parts of themselves out into the wider world. James felt his own burdens ease, almost without noticing. He remembered more of his mother's laughter than her absence, more of his father's quiet care than his silence. He remembered himself as a child in summer, barefoot and unafraid, chasing sunbeams across a wooden floor. Even the memory of Ashford House, which had once gnawed at his every step, seemed smaller in the morning's light. Just a story with an ending, just one room in a world of many. And so the days gathered. The town came alive with festivals, neighbors tending gardens, the bakery full from morning to dusk. James helped where he could, swept the stoop, repaired loose shutters, carried flour sacks, listened to old men talk about the best place to fish. At each act felt like a stitch, sewing him more firmly into the fabric of a community that didn't need to know all his ghosts to welcome him anyway. He wrote it all down, not out of fear, but gratitude, a catalog of peace, a map of ordinary happiness. Sometimes he'd walk at sunrise along the edge of the town, breathing in the new air, feeling the earth solid beneath his feet. He'd pause by the river, listen to the water running over stones, and let his mind go quiet. These moments, more than any vigil or ritual, were what kept the echo away. Still, he stayed alert. He knew the world was wide, and somewhere, someone was facing their own unfinished story, their own hungry echo. But he'd learned that peace wasn't a shield against darkness. It was a way to outlast it, to weather every storm and wake to another breath of morning. It was something that could be taught, shared, passed on, a living story, always with an ending, always open to another page. James pressed his hand to the glass as the sun climbed higher, feeling the warmth soak in. For a long moment, he just stood there, eyes closed, letting himself believe he'd truly found a place where memory could rest, where fear could pass, where the hunger had no purchase. When he opened his eyes, the world beyond his window was bright and waiting. He smiled, wrote "safe" in his notebook, and stepped into the morning, ready, at last, to keep building the kind of life no house, no echo, no unfinished story could ever take away. James learned to savor the quiet days, but he never lost the habit of preparing for the storm. He kept a box beneath his bed filled with letters, most unfinished, some sealed and ready, all of them relics of the long journey that had shaped him. There were messages to people he'd met only once, thank yous for moments of shared safety, apologies he never got to speak in person, confessions for nights spent with fear curled at the base of his spine. Some letters were meant for the lost, those who hadn't made it out, whose stories remained unwritten but not, he hoped, forgotten. He wrote new letters, too, each one a thread binding him to the world outside the hunger's reach. Letters to Lucy, who would someday want to know how an ordinary baker's assistant learned to speak hope into haunted places. Notes for Mrs. Hewitt, gratitude for every morning she handed him warmth in a cup and made the house smell like forgiveness. Letters for himself, each one a promise that he would keep moving forward, even when the echo tried to circle back. Sometimes James would take out an old letter, read it in the soft hush before dawn, and find that the ache in it had lessened. Grief became something smaller, manageable, like a scar weathered by time. He realized, with a kind of awe, that finishing a story didn't mean erasing its pain. It meant making room for something new to grow alongside it. The letters were proof of that. Some held bitterness, but most grew gentler as they aged, colored by the warmth of the quiet house, by the faces he saw each day, by the certainty that he was no longer alone. One day, Lucy found the box. She asked, "Are these stories too?" James nodded. "Yes. Some are waiting for their endings. Some helped me find mine." She wanted to read them. So he chose a few, the ones about kindness in cold places, laughter shared on broken roads. The time he gave his last dollar to a stranger who left behind a spiral scratched in a bottle cap. Lucy smiled at the endings, solemn at the unfinished ones, then drew a picture for each. A small gift for every letter, a mark of remembrance and hope. Word spread, as it always did. Other travelers left their letters, sometimes tucked between flour sacks in the bakery, sometimes handed to James in silence. There were notes of heartbreak, poems to the departed, confessions never spoken aloud. Some left addresses or names, most did not. The box filled, emptied, filled again, a living archive of stories finished and unfinished, grief made communal and softer for being shared. James began holding letter nights in the bakery's back room. People gathered with coffee and pastries, reading aloud the words they'd written but never mailed. Some burned their letters at the end, letting the smoke carry their secrets away. Some folded them up and pressed them into the walls, building a new history into the bones of the house. Each ritual was another denial to the hunger, another feast for memory, another small, stubborn act of closure. Even Mrs. Hewitt wrote a letter, just a simple note to her late husband, telling him about the girl their daughter was becoming, how proud he'd be. She cried when she read it, but laughed too. And everyone felt the room brighten. There were always tears, but they were never the end of the story. There was always another letter to write, another morning to greet. James found himself growing lighter, anchored by these small acts of courage. The house above the bakery was never truly silent anymore. It hummed with the presence of lives intersecting, stories finishing, names remembered. He came to see every letter as a stepping stone out of the echo's reach, a path that could be followed by others long after he was gone. Some nights, James would leave his own letter on the windowsill, letting the wind decide if it should stay or fly. Most were gone by morning, carried out into the world. His secrets, his hopes, his hard-won peace. He trusted that wherever they landed, they would do their work, closing another story, denying the hunger, reminding someone, anyone, that the end was always possible. And in that trust, James found a new comfort. He understood that memory, once shared, could never be truly lost. That a letter, even left behind, was never wasted if it helped someone finish what they'd begun. The hunger might still wander the world, but in this house, with every story written and every letter read, it found less and less to feed on. And that, more than anything, was the legacy James hoped to leave, not a warning, not a scar, but a world gently mended, one letter at a time. Spring pressed into summer, and the world outside the bakery grew bright and wild, flowers spilling over fences and laughter echoing through open windows. The quiet house above the bakery became, in every way, a sanctuary, not just from the echo's hunger, but from the silence that let it grow. James understood now he had never truly been running from a house, not even from Ashford's shadow, but from the loneliness that let unfinished stories fester. Here, with names spoken and letters written, loneliness had less room to take root. The last door was not a haunted threshold or a trap waiting for the careless. It was the simple door to his own room, where the afternoon sun painted golden lines across the floor. One morning, James stood before it and realized there was nothing left to fear on the other side. The house, the echo, the watcher, they were distant, toothless things, stripped of their power by the unyielding ordinariness of kindness and memory. The world had not become safe or simple, but it was no longer ruled by shadows. He spent his days helping others finish what needed finishing. Stories were told over bread and tea. Letters written and burned, endings spoken aloud until the hunger faded, leaving only relief. Sometimes the echo still called. A chill at the edge of sleep, an ache in his chest when rain battered the windows. But now he knew what to do. He answered with his name, with a story finished, with a truth offered in the open air. He was no longer a victim or just a survivor. He was a builder, a keeper of endings. On the day he decided to stay, truly stay, James stood in the quiet house and wrote the last line in his notebook. I am home. He closed it gently, leaving it on the kitchen table. He knew that the echo would keep looking for cracks, that unfinished stories would always exist somewhere, but he also knew he had done his part. Others would carry the work forward. Lucy, Mrs. Hewitt, the travelers who stopped to rest and left lighter. Every survivor who had learned to share instead of hide. That night, as twilight settled over the town, James sat with friends and neighbors on the bakery stoop. They watched the world soften into evening, shared their small worries and their bigger hopes. Someone asked him if he missed the road. He smiled and shook his head. There are other doors to open, other stories to hear. He looked up at the sky, where the first stars pricked through the blue, and felt, for the first time, not just the absence of fear, but the presence of something better, peace, hard, earned, and shared. The house was quiet around him, full of laughter and memory. The last door was open, not to the past or to the hunger, but to a future shaped by stories that would always find their ending. And somewhere, far away, a house with no name finally went dark, its windows empty, its hunger forgotten. James was home. The story, at last, was finished.